what's your primary argument against veganism being, an overall moral obligation to the individual?
Yeah. So like I'm in a weird position because like I agree with 99% of the arguments surrounding veganism. So the sentience of animals, our obligation to alleviate suffering and promote their pleasure. I mean, in fact, I'd probably draw less of a hard line between humans and animals than most people. Being the staunch utilitarian that I am, the hedonistic Benthamite. Pleasure and pain are really only the only thing that matters in my book. So I'm highly sympathetic to all the arguments saying that factory farming is one of the worst moral atrocities currently going on, maybe just in the history of humanity. Um, but I don't find that to logically entail that an individual has an obligation to abstain from eating meat. I just think there's a fundamental disconnect between the badness of killing animals and whether our individual dietary choices actually have an impact on animal welfare.
See, that's very strange to hear, obviously, for me, because the way I think of it is that, when you buy, meat, dairy, and eggs, you are supporting the industries which provide meat, dairy, and eggs. So would you say that you weren't like demanding the product when you an individual to kill a chicken, a cow, or a pig when you demand, chicken, cows, and pigs as their flesh?
Yeah, well, like if it worked on this sort of one-to-one scale of like I order and that's how many animals get killed, that would be compelling to me. But that's just not how it actually goes. So it's like, if I order a Big Mac at McDonald's, that that small tiny amount of demand that I've put on the meat industry or whatever just doesn't filter down to the slaughterhouses that are actually raising and killing animals. They don't have a ledger where they're like, oh, Vincent Barnowski didn't eat this Big Mac, so let's raise one fewer cow to slaughter. It just doesn't actually ever make it back. They order in such big amounts that the demand gets diffused through all the steps in the process. And so whether or not I eat that Big Mac at McDonald's just doesn't change the number of animals that were actually killed.
You see, I think it does. I think that like the individual actions the actions of the individual accumulate into the actions of the many. I would say that that's what markets do. They operate upon a process of one individual demands, a given product, and that the capital that is invested is how we understand overhead. So we would say, like, for example, if I was to go to McDonald's, what they do keep a track of is not necessarily numbers of sales, but profits made, and profits made like in reference to items, which is how they test whether items are actually being successful or not in the first place.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, like for example, they wouldn't trial new items. It would be pointless, it would be futile, because they wouldn't have the information necessary to gauge whether it was being successful or not.
No, absolutely.
So even on an individual store level, you could see that would be tracked. Your sale will be tracked in regards to the profits being made in relation to the orders being processed, and whether there was waste and so on, and that ends up calculating the overhead. So in what respect, like, what I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that if I was to go and demand a Big Mac at McDonald's, then they would know that they would need to supply X amount of Big Macs to make X amount of profit. But since I don't demand a Big Mac at McDonald's, and in fact don't only just avoid demanding, I actually put my money into an alternative market, which then competes with the current market. I'm undermining that market when it comes to not only supply and demand, but also in the ability to influence individuals on a greater scale. So my actions then become a disciplinary structure which forces individuals to comply with my actions rather than understand the socio-political norms in which they abide by already. Would you say that that doesn't occur?
No, so you said something that I think is kind of indicative of like the way this argument tends to go with people, which is you said individuals accumulate into groups or aggregates or whatever the word you said, and that's true. And in fact, in fact, my argument isn't so much that veganism, as in the whole phenomenon of people getting together and deciding not to eat meat, is futile. My argument is that if you pick any one individual, their individual contribution to that actually doesn't make a difference. So like whether or not I personally order a Big Mac from McDonald's doesn't even amount to a rounding error on their ledgers, but I totally agree that that if thousands, millions of people get together and decide to do this, that will actually put a demand pressure on McDonald's. I mean, you see it with things like the Impossible Burger and all these vegan alternatives that I think are great. So like, I mean, I'm in kind of a weird position here because like it's kind of weird for me to like argue publicly about this when I actually don't want to influence a bunch of people to stop being vegans, because I actually I hope that half the country goes vegan or whatever. That would be awesome, because that would really change how many animals are killed. But
that's the thing. So why would you say that if you're saying that half the country went vegan, it would change how many animals were killed? Why would you say that the individual doesn't have a moral obligation to it? Because the way I see it is that what ethics are institutional. We understand the conventions of right and wrong based upon the concepts we are given in relation to our thinking. Like, I don't think that you could just I think you can't just reason without another individual. I would say language is reason, actually, and I'd go down that route. So when I look at the concept of equality, for example, I would say that veganism is the adaptation of the individual to the growing concept of equality to include animals. And I would say that the only way that concept is given any force is if the individuals of a language community start talking and acting in a way which reinforces that conception, that understanding of life. So if we were to say that the individual not only has I would argue that they do have somewhat an effect on the books of McDonald's. Like, okay, they won't account to a rounding error by themselves, but they know that they're part of a growing movement which does. And we know that over 500 million animals weren't born and raised because of this lowering demand, so the supply wasn't actually engaged. So, and it seems like you know that, because you said you would want half the country to go vegan.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
That would clearly help bring the supply chain, they would notice now, like, clearly that something's up. Well, clearly they are noticing something is up, which is why they're demanding vegan products. I mean, Tyson Foods has already invested into 15% of Impossible's Burger's stocks. So we're talking about and on the supply chain, we're not anywhere near like McDonald's. I mean, we're talking about production here. So when it comes to the information that's available, clearly they are coming aware that vegans are having an impact. I mean, look at even KFC's new advert. It's like, try this before you go vegan. Because they already know that people are going vegan. Like, it's inevitable. It's and more than that, it's a greater overhead for corporations. So through capitalism, it will be pushed anyway. Like, people don't realize it, but like, if you look at throughout history, most equality movements have luckily aligned with the capitalist values of the time to make more profit. Like women's liberation opened up a whole market of consumerists and a whole market of like individuals who would then be allowed the capital to consume and allow for the movement of GDP and so on in relation to into them. But black liberation, that was tied to cheap labor and things like that. So liberation is a unfortunately not necessarily the right word when it first came around. But what we can see is that with animal agriculture is costing far more than it's making. It's not only being heavily subsidized. I mean, we're talking about billions upon billions a year by the government.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
But we're also talking about, the infrastructure that's available and how much they can charge. So, like, you need to create a mass amount of infrastructure for animal agriculture. I mean, factory farms. I mean, we're talking about like 30% of the world's land mass is now occupied by farm animals. Mm-hmm. Now, those farm animals consume most of our grains, most of our horticulture, and what we would see is that if we swap to a plant-based alternative, corporations would be able to use the same products that they are feeding to animals, like soy, and produce a burger straight from that, reducing production costs and making a greater overhead, since they're probably going to charge you more anyway. So I don't see how this can fail in a capitalist environment, because I think capitalism is so much behind it, because it's so amoral to veganism that the overall benefit for corporations to go vegan will force veganism. Never mind the individual alone. But without the individual's interest in the products, then, at least to begin with, then the market won't take hold, and you won't see the driving force of advertising and everything behind the marketing campaigns, which will influence individuals and ultimately, bring an end to animal exploitation.
Yeah. And I hope all of that is right. And like I said, I'm in a weird position of agreeing. I mean, I agree with like virtually everything you said there. And let's not forget the climate change aspect of it too. Obviously moving away from animal-based diets would help out in that regard. But the thing that I come back to is, like when I as an individual am trying to make a decision about what I ought to do, that I can only make that decision for me. I can't make that for 50 million people. And so me, when I go up to that counter and I'm ordering McDonald's, I'm not influencing all of the other people that will go vegan or not. Now, that might be different for someone like Peter Singer, who, his going vegan has probably inspired tens of thousands, if not more, people to go vegan. And I think that's absolutely awesome. But that is specific to his context as sort of like, the leader of, an animal rights movement. But me as a relatively private person, just making a decision on what I'm going to eat next, I don't have any effect on the demand, and therefore, like obviously from a consequentialist perspective, I just don't have any obligation to avoid eating meat. Now, I actually, one of my professors at Ohio State, Tristram McPherson, actually has some pretty well-known arguments for veganism, and I highly suggest everybody look him up and read his stuff if you're into this kind of thing. But one of the crucial premises in his argument is that that it's morally wrong to be complicit in wrongdoing. Like even if it's not consequentially relevant. So like just participating in an act like the harm against animals, even if you don't make a difference, whether you join or not, he says is wrong. And I mean, that obviously is just going to come down to whether or not you're a consequentialist, because obviously I don't see complicity as inherently something morally objectionable.
Morally objectionable, yeah.
Right.
I guess my main point. I mean, there would be like a few points that I would make.
Yep.
So first, let's just assume you are right and that the individual couldn't influence the supply and demand, which I disagree with. I think that obviously the way I see it is that the individual can Even like working in the pub, like it would be like how much profit, like when I worked in the pub, it'd be like how much profit we are taking in on a day-to-day basis. And then that was in reference to the, the products we sold. So we knew what to order in. So obviously, where the profits are coming from and where they're not coming from. And if you're having waste, where your losses are coming from. And I think the losses are tracked just as much as the sales. So what I want to see is the greatest amount of losses in regards to animal products for corporations as well. So even though that the individual isn't necessarily, even if, let's say, imagine that their sale wasn't in reference to the big overall numbers for the corporations, but on an individual store-based level, we could see that certain products were causing the most losses. They will be scrapped. And that's what I think will happen. It's gonna be more of like, it's like when you talk about natural selection, it's typically more of like extinction of the weak than survival of the fittest. It's not that we have to make these burgers outcompete, like, Impossible Burger doesn't have to outcompete Big Mac kind of burgers by being vegan and promoting a vegan lifestyle. It just has to show either a sound amount of profit and a least amount of losses, and in which case the individual can affect that by placing their capital into these structures. But let's just go from the point of whether individuals actually do, let's say they don't make a difference. Would it be wrong to be complicit? Well, first, I think that we shouldn't look at ethics as purely consequential. That's not how we should understand how to act, because if we did look at things purely consequentially, don't get me wrong, like, I'm a Hegelian, so consequentialism is incredibly important in Hegel. There's actually an essay written on Hegel by, is it Tom Brooks? I'll have to double check. It's called the Consequentialism and Deontology within Hegelian Abstract Right, I think it's called. And what they argue is that Hegel understands like values being pushed through society. So like this is through the pressure of history, like as in the growing of the concept. And so what we'll see is that we all actually operate somewhat deontology. W.D. Ross says this when he says, let's say I could do the same amount of like utility by saving a random person or saving my mother. Should I save my mother or should I save the random person? Well, the pure consequentialist said there wouldn't be a difference, right? Unless they have a broader understanding of consequentialism, as W.D. Ross is pointing towards. He's not saying that consequences don't matter, but that it's how we operate in the world that brings around the consequences in the first place. And that is not collapsed into one given act. It's collapsed into a whole behavioral process. And that's why virtue ethics is so valuable, because we understand how to behave in the world and our behaviors as influencing the overall changes within the world. So what I would say is that we should look at a way of behaving which propagates those values that we align ourselves with in the first place. So that would be responding to something like, if you could create the same amount of utility, you should help your mom, because if you help your mom, then you're propagating a family structure within society, and everyone starts helping their mom. Because everyone helps their mom, then we have a structure which protects against harm by obligating individuals to a certain way of life. Now, that's a somewhat disciplinary structure. So someone that I would I think that's a good person to read in this regard is around power is Luke's, and he talks about the third dimension of power. So that is where he says gives a man his very wants. So it's how you understand yourself within the world. It's how you actually understand how to express the subjectivity that is inherent within you. And to do that, you need certain concepts. And these concepts are not given to you from birth. They're not given to you in your rational decision-making process by yourself, but are given to you by your understanding of the world, which is tied into your language within your socioeconomic position. I understand myself as, a son, a brother, a worker, and all of these different, what I would call thick, what would I call them? Thick identifiers. They include me, but in a way in which tells me how I should behave. There's a hegemonic aspect to it, but it liberates me from the from the tragedy, or what Levinas calls the essential poverty of my existence, where I don't know how to behave, and I would have to reason out everything, but I would have to do that bit by bit with another individual. Now, of course, we should challenge all of our traditions and see if they're just or not in the first place. That's fair enough. Like, should I help my mother? Should I help my brother? So on.
Right.
And, you know, try and propagate disciplinary structures and deontological structures that create the greatest utility. But to do this, we have to act within those structures that are already given, because otherwise we wouldn't understand how to bring it around. There'll be no ability to make a positive claim. And this is why skepticism can be so damaging. Because if you're totally skeptical and you take, let's say you were to take a God's eye view from utility, then the individual's action becomes unknowable. But if you take a very institutional view, the individual's action is inherently knowable. It is given to you. And then from that point, you work out whether you should or should actually align with that duty in the first place. So this is where I would say we should understand what is right or wrong to the individual. We should understand our duties, and we should understand why we do our duties. And why we do our duties is because of the consequences.
Yeah, so I actually like that, and we agree on more than you might be imagining. I think with the case of the should you save your mom or the random person, I think that's just kind of actually smuggling in more consequences. So when you save your mom, you know, you're promoting, you know, your family structure, what have you, all those sort of indirect benefits you get from saving your mom as opposed to saving the random person. So I think you're still operating on a consequentialist framework. You're just kind of zooming out a little bit on the consequences, which actually I guess is a good segue into kind of how I view consequentialism, because it's been sort of a recent development in my thinking that basically, you know, so the right action is the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes suffering. Okay, but so often when we talk about these sort of these thought experiments, you know, like the trolley problem, or, you know, this saving your mom or the stranger, we draw sort of arbitrary lines around what we're calling the consequences. So it's like, oh, so you saved 5 people instead of the one person. So the consequence was you saved 5 people, you know, you're on net, you saved 4. Except that's not actually where the consequences of any of our actions end. So, you know, one way I've thought about it is like, you might say on a consequentialist framework that it's good to go out and do a random act of kindness for somebody. Let's say hand them $100. You know, so you've increased utility. Well, except 5 minutes after that, maybe because you stopped him, now he turns around across the street and gets hit by a car.
Oh yeah. That's like probability. Isn't it?
Right. So the consequences of anything you do, you know, well-intentioned or not, are so hard to know, even just in the very short term. But what actually matters isn't just in the short term or the medium term, but if we're trying to maximize utility, we have to be thinking about like all of the, like for the rest of time, you know, all the future people who will be benefited or burdened by our actions. And any individual action, it's just impossible to know how that action is going to sort of ripple through time. You know, it's kind of like the butterfly effect, but in morality, where it's like, you know, one flap of the wings, or in this case, one, you know, small deed of kindness or whatever, you know, dominoes into a million different things over the years, and you just have no idea what any of your long-term consequences are going to be. So I'm kind of skeptical that like there's any practical way to know what the right thing to do in any situation is.
You see, like what you're arguing for is what's called like almost perfect utilitarianism, is what it sounds like. Which I actually really appreciate. This idea that we're moving towards a perfect concept of justice was what I would be arguing for as a Hegelian. The correct, what I would say would be the correct deontological structure would be giving us that, because we would know with certainty, if we had perfect knowledge, that our actions would produce said consequences, because perfect knowledge gives us, the knowledge of consequences,
Right.
and its relation to action.
Yeah.
Of course, we'd have to be God. And,
Yeah, sort of Laplace's demon sort of
yeah,
situation.
but I guess the point of what I'm gonna argue for, one, is knowledge is not certain, it is probabilistic, and the way that we approach knowledge is about what is most probably true rather than what is actually true. And the actual truth is what we are moving towards in the first place, which is why our concepts in regards to reality constantly improve, because they allow for a better predictive process upon the world. I mean, this can be seen in something like Newtonian physics moving to general relativity, because it answers more questions, and then quantum mechanics because it answers more questions again.
Yeah.
Now, that's how knowledge works. It builds upon itself conceptually to overcome contradictions within itself. Now, that's fair enough, and I understand that it's not going to give us a perfect metric ever to achieve, what is the good, and there is always that possibility of harm. But Heidegger's right and says that we are beings who understand, who live in possibility. That is what we live in, and when we use logic and we make decisions about our actions, what we are actually gauging, like, I don't know if, putting my hand on the table, whether my hand's actually going to hit the table. I know with a somewhat certainty, in the sense that I have good epistemic justifications behind that, and I can go so far back to say that, yes, my hand is actually going to touch the table when I put it down. But there is always that absolute possibility, for some reason, a plane flies through my window and I lose my hand and the table.
Yeah.
I'm still sat here and I just absolutely miss. But the likelihood is what we're talking about, and I hope that's clear. Like, the chances of a plane hitting through my window is going to be fairly low, and the chances of my hand not touching the table, therefore, is going to be pretty low. And that's what we need to work on. And the overall positive utility in the world, we aren't maximizing the consequences, we are maximizing our actions towards them. And this is like, there's going to be a meme about me saying this, but ethics comes from the Greek word ethikos, which is derived from the word of character, and the whole point about it is about our behaviors within the world. It has nothing to do, like morality and ethics have really nothing to do with the consequences for certain, because that is unknowable. That goes beyond human capacity. All they have to do is with how good our actions are, and they are measured against the probability of bringing a good consequence. So if I was to kill someone, the probability of me causing suffering would be greater, because I am taking the action to intentionally cause suffering. So what I say is that we need to act in such a way that reduces the probability of suffering. And that can be done with veganism. And more so, understanding it institutionally, it's not just my action. I think when you point towards, for example, individuals being almost unknowable, and their actions and so on, like individual duties, it sounds like a quote I heard like a while ago in Sherlock Holmes, where he says, "Man by himself is an enigma." Because of the many facets of his being, his psychology, he's unknowable what he is. And Iris Murdoch calls him an endless task. But then he says, "Man together is a scientific inevitability." Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, okay? But what I will say is it is a lot easier to track the trends and movements of individuals than it is of a given individual. Like, to predict one individual's behavior is a lot harder than to predict a societal shift,
right,
because you have more information to go off. And the beautiful thing is that if Hegel's right and we use our concepts in such a way that we are actually testing our understanding against the world and institutionalizing it, and that's how we are actually sharing a common experience and an understanding of that experience, and that's how we have this common world, this common objective world from which we operate, then the reality is, when we act within the world, when we try to do the right thing and have a notion of the right thing and operate with concepts and apply reason rigorously to those concepts and come to a conclusion and a certain behavioral pattern, when we institutionalize that, we are offering it up for critique. And the more people who accept it as true and verify it, the more people who will continue to act that way, because that will then become the dominant concept of right. And this is why he says there is abstract right. And that's what we are moving towards. Perfect knowledge would mean a perfect conception of abstract right, which would be maximizing the probability of good.
Yeah. I guess what I would say is that sure, like I totally agree that ethics needs to be this sort of maybe I don't agree with that. What I do think is that we can get closer to the right answers through these sort of institutional norms and policies. I mean that's why I want to go into public policy, because I think that's where we can actually sort of have a decent probabilistic sort of guess at producing the most consequences. Because I think any individual action, you can't begin to put what's the probability that doing this podcast right now has a positive consequence on net over the next 1,000 years. I mean, it's just completely pointless to even try to do probability on that. But now, if the question's should abortion result in the public hanging of the women who get it done, avoiding that is something that I think we can have a pretty good guess at on its long-term consequences. But again, my argument really does just narrowly apply to what should any individual do, and an individual just isn't those institutions. So it's I totally agree that what we should be putting on billboards and stuff is are advertisements for doing the right thing and sort of instilling this cultural movement towards good things like veganism. But again, when I ask myself, what should I personally be doing? It's just not clear to me that I have any sort of causal role in institutionalizing these ethical norms. And now, again, if you're somebody like Peter Singer who does have an audience, then I agree. But when I get through my day-to-day life, I'm just I could die 30 seconds from now, and nothing about institutional norms will change with or without me. So,
see, I disagree.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
I would totally disagree. I would say that when you act within the world, you are using a method of power, and that power is to bring people verification. That's what people rely upon to know whether their actions are acceptable or not. I mean, it's like peer pressure. It's like you don't necessarily have people saying something is acceptable or not within a group of kids who smoke, for example. They may all feel like it is not acceptable to smoke, and yet most of them will smoke because other individuals around them smoke. It's like how smoking is treated on an individual basis ultimately determines the atmosphere of and the social dynamic in which we approach life. If people stop eating Big Macs and they feel that eating Big Macs will be looked upon then as socially unacceptable by the other individual, that will force them into changing and modifying their own behavior. I mean, disciplinary systems do this all the time. They don't operate by forcing it's far more effective to change an individual's minute behaviors so that they change themselves rather than forcing political change. I mean, look at for example, the reactionary conservatism that comes from America. You try and force political change when it comes to liberalism, and they react to not only not agree with that authority, but to rebel against it. And then you have a way of overpowering the social norms. However, let's say rather than trying to force a political ideology, you instead help someone understand themselves and create an identity in such a way which when they try to represent who they are, they fall into an ideological stance such as conservatism or liberalism, then what you have is a group of subservient hegemonic followers who will do the bidding of the ideological stance without having ever told to do the bidding. They don't need to be told implicitly their stance on abortion. They can just be told, this is our stance on this, and these are the values that we care about. Like we care about liberty, or we care about equality. Now, if you're any kind of moral philosopher, you should care about both. But it's a way of fragmenting the individual's understanding of themselves in such a way that they express their identity in relation to the concepts that are held within a group of individuals, but that they only understand those concepts in relation to observing how other individuals act. People are possessed by other people's personalities. They're not possessed by anything else. It's you understand yourself in relation to others. I think Foucault says this best when he says power produces. I think he says that we should stop looking at power in negative terms. Power produces. It produces power produces. It produces domains of reality and rituals of truth. And like, this is the point. Like, it's the small behaviors that he points to that, produce an individual, for example, like a soldier. Like, when you produce a soldier, you don't tell him, like, this is how you behave, like, this is how you act as a soldier, and give him a guidebook. You start changing these small, minute behaviors. So you'd say, like, make your bed this way, you do this when you run, like, this is how you carry yourself, and you turn someone into an individual who wants to be a soldier, and they maximize their efforts to producing themselves to match the values that you have propagated within them. And this is the kind of power that I'm talking about. It's more effective than political power, because political power, and this is why Marxism has led to an appreciation of institutional power. And this is why Marx talked about ideology and his criticism of Hegel in the first place, because he says, ideology has possessed us already. How do I know that I'm expressing what is right, or if I'm expressing an ideological concept of power which has told me that it is right? How do I know that it is my will or the will of another? And even Nietzsche talks about this. And I would say that it's about, if we were to truly look at it like metaethically, then we need to understand the concept of good in the first place. So when we enter a language game around this concept and these thick ethical concepts, we can see whether or not they actually tie into the suffering and the suffering of sentient beings. And that's one way to do it. But ultimately, I think it's somewhat naive to dismiss disciplinary power over political power, because I think not only is political power less effective, but I think that it can only be effective at excelling an ideological stance in the first place. Because unless it's a democracy and it was totally democratic and these individuals are actually progressing a concept of right, then you will be progressing an individual concept of right, which is generated through caprice and lacks any moral verification process. You're relying upon the opinion of like-minded people, for example, or did the liberals come into power, or did the conservatives come into power? And what they do is they fulfill policies which reflect their understanding of the world that hasn't been challenged properly by an opposition. I mean, there is no confliction within a party state. This is why party politics fails in the first place. So what you end up doing is, no matter how well-intentioned the party is, just forcing an ideological view upon the majority of the populace, and whether that's even effective or not is not necessarily a given.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, like, again, I just agree with so much of what you say, and I think changing culture and sort of hearts and minds is often the necessary prerequisite to any sort of political change. It's just, I just think there's a little bit of a sleight of hand going on where it's like you kind of, and some of it has to do with just our language and just how we talk in common parlance, but we kind of keep slipping from the individual to individuals and groups, and I like, so if an individual does have this sort of capacity to have widespread influence based on like sort of leading by example, being a vegan or not smoking, as you said, then sure, I agree that like they should be doing what they have in their causal power to influence. I guess I'm just very much skeptical that that what I do or what the average person has so little influence. And it's again, I understand that if a bunch of individuals get together and do something, that's fine, but no one person is a bunch of individuals. I mean, it's commonly phrased as like the problem of inconsequentialism, which there's a whole bunch of thought experiments and stuff about. But go ahead.
He has the issue that I see. It's like it's not an appreciation for the dynamics of social life. Like, for example, do I have an influence in my family? Yes. Like, my going vegan has influenced my mother to go vegan. I was influenced by my girlfriend. And, ultimately, most of us have been influenced by Peter Singer, don't get me wrong. Yeah. And he's had a greater influence because of his ability to influence a greater amount of, greatest dynamic, the greatest expression of institutional dynamics, because of being a public figure. He's in the hearts and minds of individuals through their television screens or the papers in which they read or whatever public platform that he's in, even the books that he's written. So don't get me wrong, he has the greatest expression of these of institutional power, but that doesn't mean we don't have any. And it wouldn't matter if Peter Singer was an academic. Like, take for example, let's say someone stood up on a platform and started preaching anti-Semitism. Now, I think that in our culture, he's more likely to be stoned than, and I don't mean high as out. He's more likely to be stoned and cast aside because of the minds of the individuals who are watching it. Now, now imagine, rather than that, you put an anti-Semite in every single home, right? Like, now people associate.
But notice how many you've gone from an anti-Semite to a bunch of them. Like, this is kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know.
It just kind of slips into like a bunch.
Okay, even one home then. Let's just say like you put an anti-Semite in one home, you're more likely to produce an anti-Semitic family that way. Like, okay, because they'll understand their appropriate behaviors in relation to how those who they trust are behaving. And the arguments in which they are making, they're more likely to listen to them. They're more likely to appreciate what they're actually talking about. Now, I guess the issue is that if we, like with veganism, it's a moral, I can make a strong, what I would consider a strong moral argument for the consideration of animals and the consideration of, other sentient beings and why, and the meta-ethics behind it,
Yeah, which I would agree with. Yeah.
But the issue is getting, like, those around you to go vegan. Like, you influence those around you. The point is that we don't exist in one single, demographic or institution. So I influence, like for example, like being a YouTuber, I'm influencing those around me by making it socially acceptable to speak about veganism. So when you're talking about political power, the second dimension of power, for example, is the ability to speak about something in the first place. So, like, it doesn't matter if it's on a billboard or it doesn't matter if it's, an individual speaking about it in your proximity. It changes the power which is acting upon you in the first place. Like, the ways in which people will behave are in relation to the ways in which people do behave. Now, you can choose to act in such a way that populates and produces norms and conventions, and defies the current conceptions and replaces them. Now that is what I think veganism is doing. But it's effective as well, because if you look at the broad demographics in which people are being influenced. You can see that it's actually going across the board. Like, you're getting vegan kids now. You've got vegan working class. You've got vegan upper class. You've got vegan middle class. And it seems that this would not be applicable if we were forcing legislation, for example, or if we had a particular public speaker, because people wouldn't associate their identities with them in the first place. But if we influence people through, rational argumentation, and they appreciate it in the first place, people influence other individuals, and it will propagate one from the next. We're like dominoes, we're sheep, we'll follow each other, we'll have a pack mentality. So I think that if you like, the reason that we end up with these individuals in the first place is because an individual's got the ball rolling. And that's what I'm saying. So when you say, like, what moral obligation do I have to go vegan in relation to consequences? Well, you'll be maximizing the probability of them being more vegans within the world. You will be maximizing, and that will maximize the probability of animal liberation.
That's a really good argument for why everyone should tell everyone they should be vegans and should try to convince everybody to be vegans. But at the end of the day, let's say Peter Singer actually, when he goes home, actually eats a 72-ounce steak every night. I don't think he will have done any worse for the cause than all the good things he's done. Yes, you or Peter Singer have obviously differences in scale, but you've influenced people to eat this way, and that's good. I'm like pro advertising for veganism, but whether at the end of the day I come home and eat meat in private, I think doesn't matter, and I think it'd be hard to convince me that doing so would matter. Now, okay,
let's try and convince you then. So, like, for example, you understand, like, as I said, that the way that we actually reach this point is because of individuals buying these products in the first place. And you said, like, obviously but that means that the individual's sincerity towards the concept is what matters. So if people weren't sincere towards being vegan, if they never entered the language game with trustfulness and sincerity, which is why, people like Alistair McIntyre said that underpins all of our language games is the virtue of trust, then no one would be vegan. They would all go home and, they'd be eating steaks. You wouldn't actually haven't influenced anyone, and veganism would be an appearance. It would be a performance. It wouldn't be an actual ideological stance an individual's adopted in regards to their ethics in their morality.
But if it's a convincing performance, then that kind of is all that matters. Like what if Peter Singer really? I mean, obviously he doesn't. But like, what if he really is eating a steak every night at home? Will the animal rights movement have been any worse off? I don't think so.
No, but the difference is it's not about whether Peter Singer alone does that. It's about whether. Like, for example, if those around him see him eating meat, and if he eats meat, then he knows he's demanding this small, incredibly marginal difference, right? It's incredibly marginal. Like, we know that. Like, the individual's effects are limited. But that is an effect, for one, and it is part of the overall change within the institution, within the capitalist environment, whether or not it is actually profitable or not to keep ordering in these products. You're actually undermining the losses. Now, that's part of the argument within veganism in the first place. So if he became a vegan, not only would I say that he would have a positive role in undermining these structures, but it would also help those around him understand themselves in relation to his behaviors. I mean, like how to be vegan is just as important as why to be vegan. So, like, if he didn't show there was options, show that there was an ability to eat this way, and show that he does eat this way and act in such a manner, then his performance would be empty in the first place. Now, the performance of being vegan is not as powerful as being vegan only because it is the overall impact of individuals. But the overall impact of individuals is based on their sincerity in the first place. And so this is why I take a virtue ethical stance on it, because we need the concept of trust and truthfulness and sincerity before we can really be ethical. Because otherwise, all of it's a facade. Because if we propagate that, like, for example, it's like when Mill says, well, what if we lie? What if we just say that we've murdered everyone and we've actually just shipped them off and the death penalty doesn't really exist, but people think it does, so the deterrent still works, but we never actually have the negative utilitarian impact. But he's like, oh, wait, what happens when everyone finds out? And he says, well, that then creates a negative utility.
Yeah.
So that's one point you could make. But also, I think that the lack of sincerity within him, I think, would probably hinder his performance as well. And I think the marginal change in utility would hinder the movement's actual effect upon the industry. We can only, the industry will only respond to the sincerity of a vegan life, not to the performance of vegans.
I was mostly with you probably till the last end. So I totally agree that that an individual actually, so Peter Singer, let's stick with Peter Singer. Him being a vegan and not being exposed as not vegan absolutely helps his case. I mean, because people, would call him a massive hypocrite if they saw him, eating meat, which I see no intrinsic moral problems with hypocrisy, but that's an argument for another day. But I'm quite okay with with it being a facade. But like you said, you run this risk of being exposed, and then it sort of all backfires. And then they say things like, "Oh, see, if even Peter Singer's not a real vegan, then no vegans are." And then it backfires on the whole movement. I totally get that, and I get the psychological argument of you won't be your best vegan, or you won't be the best advocate for veganism unless you really are a vegan, which is actually why I'm not sort of I personally am not arguing for veganism all the time, because I don't think I could be that ideal sort of advocate as someone like you can actually living it.
But do you not think that if, let's say, you became vegan, it would help you understand the way of life in such a way that would help you promote the performance in the first place of being vegan ideologically? And do you not think that when you act as a vegan and you influence, that overall market trend, can you not see your place within it? Can you not see that the subjective finds itself in the objective?
So I don't think that if I stopped eating meat, that any restaurant that I would ever go to will stop ordering a certain meat food item on the menu. I don't think McDonald's will ever put in one fewer order for. Well, the thing is, even describing it that way isn't quite right. It's not like when McDonald's gets an order, they put an order in for an animal to be slaughtered. It's like you have these factory farms where they're killing a bunch of animals, and they then package it and ship it off in these large bundles to distributors, and distributors then send it out. So it just doesn't work. The only way that an actual so maybe if you had a farmer down the street that you were buying meat from or whatever, and you stopped going to him, and he did all parts from the slaughtering to the packaging to the point of sale, maybe then you'd prevent a cow from being killed or something, maybe, I don't know, but but the demand just gets diffused so much, and then so no, I guess I don't see how any acting sincerely on it actually would play any role. I think if I could convince everybody else that I was a vegan and just secretly ate meat at home, I don't see what the difference would be ethically there.
You see, well, I would see the difference, and mainly because for example, how do you understand that an individual has the impact that they do, even on a group level? They have an impact as a group because the sales reflect the group sales. But the group is comprised of individuals who are affecting those sales. So unless the individuals actually do buy or don't buy products, or on an individual level, it will not turn into a trend. And that's how that works. But like, look at it. Like you said, McDonald's, right? You said like, you going to McDonald's, they don't actually put in an order in for like, they wouldn't be like they don't fry the order, for example. They don't even fry the order, right? So they like sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, right? So it depends upon like rush hours and stuff like that. So, but the more waste there would be, like say they didn't fry the order and that they, would cook 200 patties a day. Because if they do fry the order, that's even easier to track. Because then you would say like per individual order, we know we get this many orders and, that's how much profit we're making and how many patties we need. But let's say that they don't get, that they don't get, they don't fry the order. Instead, they fry 200 patties a day. Or they do fry the order, and we'll get onto that in a second. So 200 patties a day. Let's say that's because they get 200, average of 200, 200 orders a day. But some days they get 190, some days they get 180, some days they get 230, it varies. But let's say overall, the average starts to drop, the mean average starts to drop. So what they do is they realize that they are frying too many and that it will now be spoiling, so that it will be costing them money. But that blip, well, first that's I mean, it depends on who you are, doesn't it? Like if you're going to be McDonald's like 3 times a day, depending on who you are. But the thing is that you could, the point is that you're affecting the average sales there. And yeah, but only through by those small marginal changes will you create a greater marginal difference. Otherwise, it will never build up in the first place. Well, of course, it depends upon McDonald's ability to understand and read the data. I mean, they're doing it the best way they can anyway, because the most efficient way they can read that data, the most efficient way they can make profits, which is why it's about the knowledge economy. It's about um, how the individual um, it's about how they know how the individual acts, and it's like futures, for example. They will be able to predict upon individual actions to the greatest degree, which is why they keep demanding more and more personal information. It's not because they care about you. It's because if they can get more personal information on you, they can predict the changes in the market, which includes you, right? That's how markets work. They're not comprised of any amount of all of individuals. They're comprised of all individuals. Sorry, they're not comprised of one group, and it's one thing that they track. What they're tracking is multiple exchanges. Mm-hmm. They're tracking one individual operating through their day-to-day life as much as possible, so that they can achieve the greatest overall predictive power in relation to maximizing profits and cutting losses. Now, if you operate as a vegan during your day-to-day life, that means that you are cutting meat, dairy, and eggs out of pretty much every single meal, right? Now, I mean, that overall is a considerable amount of value, and that's what they're tracking. They're tracking the exchange of profit. Now, on a day-to-day basis, even that mightn't seem like much, but it starts to accumulate more and more, even on an individual level. Like for example, the pub that I used to work in, like they would know if there was like a couple of £100 difference compared to like the end of a night, for example. They would be able to clearly see that. £1, no, of course they wouldn't. Now, £1 might be the cost of some chicken nuggets, right? And someone could have ordered that chicken nugget. They're not going to notice, right? They probably wouldn't even notice if they lost the chicken nuggets. I mean, like, I mean, that's how that works, right? But what they will notice is that by you not ordering that chicken nugget for, I don't know, those chicken nuggets for every day for a week, right? Then there'll be a £7 difference, right? For a month, then there'll be, a £70 difference. For a year, maybe £100, like 700, like £1,000. Now, like what actions compile upon each other, and it's not just in one industry as well. And obviously, like they accumulate with each other, and they act in such a way that you should see individuals as essentially ripples on a pond. When we act in a way that is moral, what we do is we reinforce the wave formation of another ripple. Now we can cancel each other out by like one person buying chicken nuggets and one person not, and we can create negative what's the word? Trying to remember my physics now. Negative. If anyone in the chat can remember when negative, like is it wave deconstruction? No, negative interference, or you can create positive interference. Now, positive interference would be the overall like size of the wave. The wave will be stronger with two ripples than it would be with a big dunk in the water, because positive reinforcement works in such a way that it will, like, you know, maybe like a couple of pence that are different and so on like that, and the ripple is seen through a longer period of time than it would have been in the first place. Like for example, you may be able to affect the economics of a given moment through a large amount of spending or a large amount of political influence, but through a vegan life, you'll be affecting the economics of a whole temporal span in a relationship to other people living that life. So, like, one action has a rippling consequence which can either reinforce another individual's action and lead to a change, or it can cancel it out. And that's how you should understand it. Like, that's why ethics are institutional, because even in regards to economics, if we were to see that one person orders chicken nuggets, one person doesn't, well, they still order the same amount of chicken nuggets. If two people don't order chicken nuggets, then we'll start to see changes, and they reinforce the changes made by each other. So by acting in a selfish way, by acting in a way that doesn't conform to the deontological structure of the ethical life, I am undermining that ethical life, and the actions that it proposes will be the consequences. I am modifying the possibilities of good in relation to the overall institution.
Yeah. So, well, in your wave analogy, I think we're more like individual molecules of H2O and not individual waves ourselves. Like I think, you know, whether or not any one of those individual molecules of H2O cooperate with the wave is irrelevant to whether the wave is going to happen. But it's also true that waves are made up of H2O molecules. So I mean, again, it just gets into this slippery sort of arbitrary way we sort of define individuals and groups. But at the end of the day, just, you know, if we do have as much influence, I mean, I know I've said this before, if we do have as much influence as what you're suggesting, I think that there is a sort of moral obligation there to be vegan. But I'm just not convinced. You know, so when you say the restaurants and the chicken nuggets thing, it's like, okay, so they won't notice, you know, a pound difference here or there, but then they'll notice if it's every day for a week, or, you know, every week for a year. That starts to notice. Except we're not ordering all of our meat from one specific place. It gets spread out so thinly across so many different, you know, McDonald's one day, Wendy's the next, Taco Bell the day after that. And none of those places are changing what they order based on one individual's
they really
demand.
are. But they really are. Like for example, veganism is a growing movement from individuals. People are acting as a wave, right? You're seeing like for example, like, how do waves form? What, like, one molecule hits the next molecule, which spins it onwards. You know, and if it wasn't for the movement and the force moving through the first few molecules that received the impact, that transferred the force, obviously the greater the force given to that, the more energy that was put in, the greater the size of the wave will be. But it is this directional force which ultimately changes the behavior and the fluid dynamics of the overall body of water.
But any one of those molecules doesn't matter to it, though.
No, but one of those, well, this is the thing, right? First, I think that don't say that it's not that they don't matter. I mean, they matter as much as the body of water because that's what they are. Like in the sense that it is their value that comprises, for example, like it's the individual value that comprises the total utility in the first place. Because if we were to kill all individuals, there'd be no such thing as doing a good thing, for example, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that would
So
be killing all individuals, not one.
no, but this is the thing. But like, if you kill one individual, the value is still being lowered. That's why caring for a single individual overall impacts the value, and it's the same thing with everything that we do.
Yeah. One thing I guess I should point out there is when we're talking about like killing somebody or whatever, that makes a difference because you've just made a difference to somebody. Like somebody is actually directly impacted by you killing them. Obviously,
Your action, yeah.
right. But what I'm saying is that no fewer animals actually end up getting killed on the other end.
Well, I think with veganism is actually succeeding in reducing animal suffering. Like, look at it. Like,
it is. But just I don't think if any one vegan reverted to eating meat that any progress would have been lost.
Well, I think that is almost like denying that the veganism was comprised of them in the first place. Like, you're not accepting their position within the group dynamic. You're not accepting their position within the overall trend. Like, it would be you're understanding the trend, but without what it is comprised of. It's like for example, if we take this back to like physics and like ideal gas laws, we understand like how gases operate depend upon what they are comprised upon, those individual atoms, and that overall determines the composition of the gas and how the gas will actually flow. Now, if you put like a tiny hydrogen atom amongst like a sea of nitrogen or something, like, yeah, you're probably not going to even notice the nitrogen. It's not going to change how the gas will work within a given environment, but like depending upon the sensitivity of your measure and so on like that. So that would be like how McDonald's would check, how capable they are of checking. But if you were to add more and more, and that hydrogen is having somewhat of an effect. We know it will be having an effect, but we know that it's so marginal we cannot detect it. Now, it is the reinforcement that makes it detectable. Now, that's what we need to do. It's like not understanding your personal responsibility, and since you can only have and you can only influence your own responsibility and your own actions, as you said in the first place, then you would be denying your place within the group. You can either understand yourself as part of one group or understand yourself as either or part of another, and you can either be part of the problem or the solution in this respect.
So I actually sort of see where we might be going off the rails a little bit here. Again, I do think it's a little bit of a sleight of hand to transfer properties of groups to the individuals. But the important thing, the important maybe implicit point that I'm making with veganism is that it doesn't scale linearly. Like, so it's not like just each additional person ordering meat increases exactly in the proportion of animals slaughtered. It's like you have to hit certain thresholds before it's even noticed. So it's like I totally agree that let's say you have
threshold. The only way to reach that threshold is to make an individual decision in the first place.
Well, no, you need a group which I understand is comprised of.
A group's actions are comprised of the individual's actions. Like, are they not? Like if we had a group, you wouldn't like to say that like. Would it be the same, do you think, if it's like look at it like this. Like, black people in America were incredibly poor during the time of Marcus Garvey, right? Like, they were incredibly poor. They had next to no economic strength. Yet when they come together, they were able to buy the Black Star Line, ship. Now, it was a terrible idea, and actually Marcus Garvey was an awful kind of guy at business, and he got ripped off and like charged 3 times more. But that only goes to reinforce the fact that together the individual had no wealth, like next to none, like marginally, like had no influence. But when they operated together, they had that influence, but that was only by individuals buying shares within the company in the first place, and that is how companies operate, by individual products. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother selling us products, would they? They would instead operate on a position where they would only sell to other corporations, other distributors, and then they would just hand the products out, and we would pay into maybe we would never even get paid. Like, I could see that like replacing our current economic system, but it's certainly not the economic system we're in now. Like, capitalism is dependent upon the economic force of an individual to see shifts and trends and track that. That's what markets are comprised of, and that's why they're so hard to track in the first place.
But again, though, it's only once it meets a certain threshold. Because, like, I mean, you said in your own answer that, like, well, so none of those individuals on their own make a sort of, a meaningful contribution. And if any one of those dropped out, they, it still would have happened.
It is a meaningful contribution. Like, any contribution is a meaningful contribution, is what I'm saying. It's just not as significant as a greater contribution. So, like, if you had more economic force, you have more power, of course. Like, that's just the way it works. Like, if I was a billionaire and I could invest into Impossible Foods or invest into another corporation, of course I have more political strength. But the political strength of individuals, like the economic force of individuals, can compile upon each other. But it can only do that if we continue to act in that way. So you are obligated to become part of the possibility, of the probability. You're not the solution itself, you're only a part of it. Now,
that's the part I think we're gonna rub about, is that like, if you're not consequentially involved in the outcome, I guess I don't understand what it means to say, like, you were morally obligated to be a part of it. And like again, I understand that this is kind of a slippery, and I think it has something to do with our language, but trying to move from individuals to groups, I think maybe a good analogy here would be like voting. So say, you need 10,000 votes to win an election. Well, any individual vote there doesn't really matter unless it's the one that changes from 9,999 to 10,000.
But and
it's not worth anything unless you hit the 10,000.
But I think that's the wrong way of seeing it, because like, you're seeing that every vote until that point was meaningless, pointless, futile. But what you should be looking at is that every vote that helps you reach that point is meaningful and has had power within the world.
Yeah.
Once you reach that. So it's about
so if it hits 10,000 exactly, then well, all of them individually are as consequential and meaningful, because if you take one out, okay, that's fine, but those aren't the margins here. That's it doesn't operate on that fine of tipping points, except in these extremely weird scenarios like the thought experiment. That's kind of where this thought experiment breaks down, is that that's just no elections are actually decided like that. But, like, if one fewer person votes for a national election or whatever, where the margin are millions, give or take.
Well, I mean, the whole point is, the first reason is that people need to vote in the first place. And then if people didn't actually go out and vote, and even just said that they're going out and voting, there'd be no difference. Like, there would be no differences possibly be able to make, because there would be no addition in the first place that would be one vote stacking upon the next that would lead to the change. Further, let's look at how people vote in the first place. They vote through their understanding of themselves within a group, and that's expression. So people vote because they understand this is the way we should vote, because their family votes this way, because their neighborhood votes this way, and they look at those around them for why they are voting, and they have conversations about it. Now, that's the performance, but unless people actually go out and vote, then the voting trend hasn't actually been influenced by the performance. So, like, what I'm saying is, without the sincerity of the individual to fulfill the action that they say they're going to, then they haven't actually acted ethically. Like, they haven't acted in such a way that would be considered ethical. Like, you can either act or and try and bring around what you think is justified, and you can give your reasoning for that, and in which case with veganism I think it's quite easy to, and you can be part of the probability that you'll bring around this world. Like, for example, it's a lot. Like, let's say we were imagining that there was 9,000 voters or whatever, right? And they all realized that we need at least 10,000 votes to get there. Should they all not turn up? Or should they, they try and influence every individual and then and understand themselves as part of the process and the ladder that will eventually hit 10,000? Now, what I'm saying is that by acting in such a way that aligns, if they align their actions with their values, they are maximizing the probability of creating that reality in which they seek in the first place, which is the whole point of consequentialism. Because if you don't, then the consequences can never be actualized within your actions. Like, your actions are what you control. You do it to bring around the maximum probability of that consequence, of that reality. And so that's where the significance comes from, because you understand that you will be achieving the greatest good you can possibly achieve.
But what do you think the odds are that any one of those people is the vote that actually tips the scale? I mean, so like
it doesn't matter. Like, even if it really doesn't matter.
But it has to because like if your odds of achieving a good outcome are only 1 in a million, then that doesn't seem like a rational. I mean, there's a bunch of things that you could do that would have a lot higher probability of making a difference than 1 in a million.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like that's like saying like, okay, well maybe you need to change your strategy. In which case, I agree. Like, you need to maybe try and influence other people. Like if your percentages are that small, you know what I mean? That's fair enough.
Yeah.
That's fair enough. That you understand that, but that doesn't mean that you can't do both.
It doesn't mean that you can't do both, but
if doing both would give you a slightly greater probability because you're influencing others and acting in such a way yourself, are you not morally obligated to maximize that probability?
Well, so there's opportunity cost to any action you take, though. So let's say you go out and you're campaigning for a good candidate and you get 10,000 people to go out and vote. You've influenced that 10,000 people to vote. But, the time comes to vote and you could spend the next 3 hours voting yourself, which will have, a 1 in, millions and millions of chance to actually swing the vote. Or you could, I don't know, go volunteer at a soup kitchen or, what have you. Those 3 hours would have been better spent for you as the individual elsewhere. But like that, I don't see a problem with not having voted yourself, even though you got 10,000, because that 10,000 is worth 10,000. That has a decent chance of swaying an election.
The whole point is what you're trying to change in other people is their ideological stance that controls their actions and their behaviors. But at the same time, you're not appreciating your own ideological stance, which changes your actions and behaviors. You're actually like contradicting yourself, because what you're looking towards is this what you're appealing to is the futility of the individual, whilst trying to influence a mass of individuals through the same thing which you are rejecting. Like, you're not being consistent.
It is a
with
sort
your
of
own
paradox.
Yeah.
No, I agree that it is a sort of paradox, but that's just. But like I said earlier, like when do grains of sand become a mound? I mean, it's made up of a bunch of individuals, but that doesn't make any individual piece of sand a mound. And again, I think that's just down to a limitation or a language.
I mean, like, don't get me wrong. Like, if you're slaughtering animals yourself, like, clearly, like, you can see the change. Like, you've killed an animal. But But like, to not understand that your place in the institution is what essentially creates the demand in the first place. Like, if you are going and you are like let's say you've got to look at it like this. Rather than saying like it takes 10,000 votes to win, what happens when you vote for the other party? Because like with veganism, there is no, like, you're going to have to eat, especially, right? So there's no like middle ground. Like, you're either eating vegan or you're not eating vegan, right? Yeah. And so every time you act, you influence the negatively the actions of the group. So you've minused a vote by not turning, like, rather than not turning up to vote, instead you voted for the opposite party. Like, that's actually reducing the probability of achieving your outcome.
If, so
And
if
also,
it reduced it in a meaningful way, then I would agree. But again,
but it is a meaningful way, because the whole point of meaning in the first place is the verification between individuals around a given concept and understanding. Like, language is produced, like, for example, the languages of our society, the syntax, the grammar, it's objective from any given individual, but it exists within the minds of individuals, and in their expression and their day-to-day experience, it relates to the phenomenological experience of the individuals who it actually is comprised upon. Now, if one Russian died, the Russian language may not change to a greatest extent. The syntax will not necessarily change all that much, but the language of those Russians around him, for one, would change more dramatically, and two, the overall, if we allowed one Russian to die, we will be allowing another. We may be acting in such a way that we propagate that kind of thinking as well. So this is like, if you're repealing, it would be like an appeal to futility, and this behavior would then propagate in the minds of others, which would then negatively impact the group in the first place. Like, the only way that we can truly make the difference is if we are sincere to the actions in which we try to commit, and other people can see that sincerity, for one, and two, that we and so one, we have to be able to see that on that people one, we would have to be able to see that people act in such a way that brings around the good, and then two, we would have to act in such a way to bring around the good, because then we are influencing other individuals.
I'm not sure why. So the last part you said there. So let's say I get 10,000 people out to vote. It changes the election. Woo, we win. But I stayed home. It doesn't seem
you
like
never won anything because you weren't part of it.
No, yeah, So this is probably our sticking point. Yeah, so I don't care, like whether or not I was quote part of it or not just doesn't matter at all. Like, in real world consequence, like, I understand that, like, as a matter of the language game or whatever, we can say, well, you weren't part of it, but that's assuming that being part of it matters. Like, I just don't. I just think states of the world matter, and states of the world with more pleasure are better than states of world with more misery, and anything else is just sort of rules that we've just made up, like, and that, okay, like, so, by definition, don't matter.
Okay, let's look at it like this. First, it's impossible to understand the perfect overall consequences of an action. That's like what you kind of agreed with. Like, it's impossible. So don't do it.
So in practice, it's too hard to predict what your outcome, what the consequence of your action will be. But if you had all the information, you would be able to, in theory, predict it. Yeah.
Yeah, and
there is an objective better and worse state.
Yeah. Not only that. If Hegel's right, then you wouldn't even know what, if Hegel's right, you might not necessarily even know what that even looks like, what the better world looks like. That's the whole point. Like, you wouldn't know how to bring it around. You can have an idea, you know that it's going to be positive utility, but you don't know what that positive utility is, because you lack the concepts of being able to see what that world would actually entail. Because what it's made up of is, the continuous actions of individuals and concepts that you couldn't have any knowledge of. You would have to be able to conceptualize a concept that predicts other concepts, and it's an infinite regress. So that's why it has to be perfect knowledge. Now, what I'm trying to say is that the individual acts on an institutional basis in regards to an ethical life, control those actions which you can see around you, and those behaviors in which you know is in relation to the concept of goodness, and act towards maximizing those virtues within yourself, because then you will become the trend without implicitly acting to become the trend, because you will be controlling those you'll be acting in a deontological way, not a utilitarian one.
Well,
now, and if you don't do that,
that's going to be my problem with it.
But if you don't do that, then you will see that you will be minimizing, because you as an individual are incapable of using reason to such a high degree that you could have such a perfect predictive process, but individuals together are. And that's the point. Like, it's about what Hegel calls the common will.
So I guess I would just deny this sort of idea of a common will.
I would happily
we,
debate that, and
yeah,
but as well, like let us just say this: the it's not as well that like so. First, I think like utilitarianism is futile by itself, like without any deontological structure. Like I think it's futile.
yeah,
Um,
like well, so prescriptively, it's just
it can't give you
it's
any
too
information.
messy.
Yeah, it can't give you any information.
Pretty much.
And obviously,
Yeah,
what it's
in theory, I think it could. Just in practice, I don't think it does. But yeah, go ahead.
and so like there's no point in doing that. And I think what I'm trying to say is that the only thing you should do is work out whether you are justified in your actions in the first place and what underlies those justifications. So if you know that you're acting in such a way which would propagate the virtues of selfishness and lack of compassion and caring, and the way that we express that compassion and caring is through a certain action, then if you don't follow what would be the notion of like how we should behave prescribed by society, well then you would be you would be conceptualizing without another individual's verification, and in which case you would be incapable of verifying your rationality. It would be epistemically unjustified. So like you're saying, like what if I could do X, then it would bring around increased utility. Well, you don't know. And I use the word know specifically there because you don't know it will bring that utility. All you can do is think. Now, if you agreed institutionally that as an individual, and obviously that takes a universalized process in which we understand how people are going to behave, then we would say, how should we act when it comes to an election time? Should we all go to soup kitchens? That can be reasoned about because that involves the phenomenological experience of individuals as a
But
whole.
we shouldn't all go to soup kitchens. It's just
Exactly,
it was just a question of whether one person does.
But whether that one person does or doesn't relies upon its epistemic justifications, right? Now they can think and act in caprice and not understand the justifications for it in the first place and have no predictive power, or they can have predictive power over their actions, which relies upon the rules. And that's why we create the deontological structure, because it allows for a verification. Like it's like to divorce an individual's intentions from the consequences is silliness, but to divorce individuals from each other is absurdity.
So I do think this gets at the crux of the problem, where it's like you recognize that like predicting our consequences and stuff is basically pointless. And so you try to rebuild another way to kind of go about ethics. And I kind of say, well, the only way to really do it is through, large scale cultural and political changes.
But we
basically
are the large scale
don't
cultural changes.
That's the part. That's the pill I can't swallow. Like I can't move from me as an individual unless I were the president or unless I was a senator or something. I can't move from that to we are the whole thing, the thing that matters.
Do you not see power in like a broader sense? Because it seems like you understand power within the first two dimensions, which is like, for example, if you're Donald Trump or a senator. So if you're Donald Trump, then you may, or let's make it someone more totalitarian, like, well, like, let's say, you're
more totalitarian.
Oh yeah. Let's say you're Putin. I mean, Donald Trump, what you can say what you want about him, but he's no Vladimir Putin. He hasn't got that kind of political control. Where he's
probably only because like he's kind of restrained by various institutions.
Of course. Like, yeah, I'm not saying he's a good guy. I'm just saying he doesn't have the same power. Like, like look at it like this. Like let's say Putin, right? Like Putin, like he does what he wants, right? Like he can, and he can just do what he wants. That means his overall political might is beyond reckoning. Okay, like that's one level of power, but like, actually, let's make it somewhat like, so let's take like Putin's doing that. Let's say he tries to enforce a law upon the Russian people. Now, he can do that by literally banning something. He can legislate it, make it the case, enforce it with the might of his right hand and like push people down. Or Another way that he could do that would be silence people from talking about it in the first place so they didn't know how to do it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's political power. So you'd be like, oh, well, we're never going to talk about the opposition. It's banned. The opposition is gone. There is no opposition to my government. You know? And that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is how he actually does it. And he influences the individuals of his society to love him so much, they wouldn't even question revolting. They don't even want to question his power. They think he's a messiah. And, like, that is an individual level power that is being influenced by one man.
He influences many people, and
Yeah.
like I said, if you have that sort of influential power, you do have these sort of ethical obligations. I'm just saying, we're not all Putin. We're not all
we're not.
We're barely even.
No, we're not. But imagine instead he just operated like purely on an authoritative basis, and he didn't try and change those small behaviors in which people understand the world.
Well, that would be a less effective way of governing, for sure.
He would be undermining an ideal. He wouldn't have
Yes.
the power of an ideological stance, the minds of other individuals. Now, the reason why a sovereign is effective in the first place, like look at Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, it's comprised of small individuals who accumulate the whole. Now,
Yeah.
like the more individuals who, for example, thought, you know what, actually we need to be, let's say we're just going to have another, what is it, like what was it, like red revolution, and we're just going to go full on like Leninist again, and we're going to kill our neo-feudal leader, like he could try and fight them, or he can try and reason with them. And now if he reasoned with them and managed to convince them, the individual, if he tries to convince one individual, okay, he's going to be less effective, but it's by influencing 1, 2, 3, each one's individual's mind and their behavior is what accumulates the power in the first place.
Yeah,
It's
that accumulation.
But
yeah,
the institution is the people. It's not a person, it's the people, true. But people is person plural. Right? It's like, like that's the
so
point.
So I just don't think that the moral obligations get transferred along with that accumulation. I think that's kind of at the base of our disagreement here, is just that, like, I don't think the moral properties of actions transfer with addition. Like I think any one person can only act in like on an individual basis. And the question, I mean, so maybe this is just coming down to a word game of like what I'm defining as, you know, a consequence is something that only an individual can perform, but you're kind of including a consequence as like if you're part of something, but I mean I've used this word a couple times now, but like I just do see that as a bit of a sleight of hand, where it just you kind of just move from the individual to the group without really having a rational justification for that.
This is the point. Rational justification in the first place exists within the group. It's within the ideology, and the ideology is comprised by the individual's phenomenological experience, the language. That's how we understand the world in the first place. Like at the most basic level, like you can see that like everything is, you know, we may be like, you know, single sheep in a herd, but you know, it only takes one sheep to influence 1, 2, 3, 4 sheep around him. And that's the kind of point, and our behaviors are what do that. And like it's our behaviors within the world that actually create this difference. Now, I did say, like, obviously I'm a virtue ethicist in the first place, and I imagine the propagation of our values. But I think even in a utilitarian sense, like the only way that you would achieve the rational justification like necessary to understand the utility of your actions are basing them off universalizable behaviors. Otherwise, it's just going to be caprice, man. Like, this is the point. Like, you cannot, if your goal has to be to maximize the good, right? Like, I would not say that you could choose not to. If you're choosing not to, then what you are doing is contradicting your overall drive as an individual. Like, you know, something like what, you're acting absurdly. Kind of like what, I think it's what Camus says, man by nature is the only being that can defy his nature. And, like, that's what you're doing. You're defying your own reason itself in the first place.
But this is kind of like my so what test to some ethical arguments is just like, so what, you can't say so what to whether pleasure is good and pain is bad. I think that's something you definitionally can't say so what to, but I
Yes,
can
you
sort of
no, absolutely can.
yeah.
How not? Because like look at it like this, right? Definitionally, it depends on what you mean by pain and pleasure. Like if you mean like as in like positive or negative metaphysically appreciated phenomenological experience, so like the objects of negative and positive experienced within you, the subject, well that cannot be denied within you, right? So that's the experience. Like you cannot deny your own experience, like at the end of Cartesian reason, right? And part of that is this appreciation for positive and negative. Now, if you're saying that the definition of pain sometimes does not include people who are like into BDSM, they're into pain play. Yeah, but that's actually just a word game, right? It's no longer pain anymore if we mean negative phenomenological experience. So definitionally, what I would say is that like we by nature seek that positive or negative and seek the positive experience and seek to minimize the negative. However, the greater the positive, the better. Which is why, like, even in a hedonistic sense, I mean, like, you're a benthamite, right? So, like, you understand that, like, when you do that, like, what's it called now? I'm trying to remember what's his calculation called? The hedonic calculus. So when you do, like, the hedonic calculus, it even says, like, there's, pleasure over time is better. Like, and you can kind of make somewhat inferences based upon how much like the maximization of this positive experience within your life, and you can only do that by appreciating the lives of other people in the first place. So you'd be like looking at other people and you'd be like, okay, well, smoking increases my probability of having cancer. Smoking is bad because my probability of having cancer increases my probability of experiencing a negative phenomenological experience. I should not smoke. On an individual level, that's undeniable. On a group level, it seems that we should just be egoists, that we should just be driven towards egoism. But I would say that the individual would be incapable of understanding of how to operate within the world, those concepts in which he uses and applies to his own life without the justification of other individuals in the first place. Now, this is the point. Like you cannot reason by yourself. This is this is Hegel's criticism of Kant, because this is why it's subjective, and he doesn't see it, that he's actually acting in a subjective way because he's trusting his reason and his application of logic above the application of logic itself by everyone, and that and that is inductive and not deductive, which requires individuals to test your reasoning.
So, well. This is a wrench that we obviously won't have time to get into solving, but I actually kind of just deny individuals in general.
How
like
does
I kind of
work?
yeah. So I don't think there's ever really some like stable identity of like a person. I think there's just loci of pleasures and pains, and like for convenience and language sake we call people a person or an individual or whatever, but that we're really just like it's just essentially the universe experiencing itself.
So like Buddhism, but no, this is perfect for Hegel. Like that's why you see you reject the common will. Like you're kind of arguing for the common will. Like
so, yeah. In that sense, yeah. Where I just see pleasure and pain as properties of the universe, and the universe is better off with more pleasure than pain, and so it's not so much about like aggregating individuals. It's just about bringing about the most states of.
Okay, but how does pleasure and pain like exist within the world? Like
as
individuals,
as brain states, and so well, it sounds simple enough to say something like, well, the brain, the individual just is the brain, but then it's like, well, how do we really define the brain? Like, if you cut a little bit off, is that no longer the brain? Like, what are the essential components to making it the brain? And I think that all just like really breaks down.
No, but the one thing you doesn't break down is this idea of subjectivity,
Yeah.
which is implicit within all beings who are driven in the first place to action, and those actions are the only things that can change. This is why, ethics is a verb, it's not a noun. Like, we don't describe the good, we prescribe how to achieve greater good, and that's why we do it in the first place. That's why we act in such a way that, like, unless you're willing to lie down and die, which would be an action anyway, like, so I guess, like, I'm really arguing you can't do anything apart from try and achieve the good. But unless you were to just be non-existent, like, the whole point is that your action urging mechanism is forcing implications upon this notion of good, and you know that notion of good exists within subjects. So what we are appreciating is subjectivity. That is entirely Hegel. Like, the abstract right will include the greatest expression of subjectivity as its overall aim. The greatest good for the greatest number really is just an expression of right, but it's how we achieve that is on an individual level that builds up institutions, which builds up modes of life and ways of experiencing life together as a culture, as a state, and overall actions which we can justify as institutional actions. This is why he says it's the common will, because it's as if we would only be justified if we do not act morally, which he says is a subjective reason of a given individual, but we act ethically, which is the appreciation of a concept which is objective from an individual and epistemically justified, and we act in accordance with that. And that can only lead to a certain amount, that would lead to your, like, duties. But through achieving your duties, like through doing your duties, you start engaging with the world and testing the concept against the reality that it's constructed. He says there is only the self understanding the self. So you're testing really what your understanding of the world against your experience of the world. And if your experience of the world leads to contradictions, and it shows that there is an inherent contradiction within the concept, if enough people understand that there is a contradiction in the concept, then the concept develops and changes as the individual's morality starts to become institutionalized into ethical life, and we verify its resolution. But we can only do that by acting through the concept in the first place.
Yeah. So I guess I'm stuck on why we can only have this sort of collective notion if all individuals, or that it's necessary for individuals to contribute to that if they're, well, I don't even like the word contribute there. Participate in that if they're not contributing to it. So maybe this sort of thought experiment could help me clarify a little bit where you're coming from. So let's say kid's drowning in a pool, and there's, you and 10 other kids are splashing around and whatever. And like the splashing is actually what's making the kid drown. The water's turbulent or whatever, and the collective action is drowning this kid. And you have a choice of, you could step out and stop swimming and enjoying yourself or whatever, or you can keep doing it. But either way, nobody else is going to stop, and the kid's going to drown. Do you think that there's a moral obligation to get out of the pool, even if the kid's going to drown anyway?
Okay, what you've set up there is an essentially appeal to futility, where you've already told me that the consequences are going to be inevitable. In which case, within that act itself, I would say maximize the greatest outcome for yourself, because the other individual cannot be. No other individual can be motivated. But then you would still rely upon, how you understand yourself and the concepts given to you to achieve that in the first place. So, I mean, what you're presenting there is perfect knowledge, which we don't have. Now, if you're the point is as well that knowledge is a collective endeavor, right? The conceptualization of the world is not something that we can do individually. That would require for example, this is what I would argue. Think of it in the philosophy of mind, right? concepts in which we in the world are applied and not abstracted, right? Now, this explains like a whole lot of phenomena that I'm not really going to explain because it'll take absolutely ages, but I suggest reading a book called Pedagogik, Mental Acts and Their Objects. Essentially, the idea is that the concept is what gives us the object. So, like, this is what there's a quote from Blanchot, and he talks about like language and meaning and so on. And he says that like, and this is a very Wittgensteinian point actually, in which the concept, because it's a specific mental ability, that's what I'm defining a concept as. A specific mental ability is essentially creating or at least decoding the world in such a way that makes it interpretable by us, right? Otherwise, it would be a noisy mess, right? Full of like an absolute wave of just sense data in which no questions could be asked or answered. So what the concept is to create identities, like small pockets in which we can understand like individual objects and being tied together. Like I can understand table, I can understand like women and children and curtains and whatever it is, right? These are categorizations, but these categorizations are formed from language, and language is formed not from an individual, but from a collective. A language of one, for example, would be incapable of holding an individual to their conceptualization of the world, because like look at it like this: what gives us the way that a concept works in the first place is the rules of the game, like language games, right? But if we were to understand that our interpretation of the rule as existing in the totality of our experience and not objective from ourselves, and we cannot, approach it for verification, like have I used this word correctly, and the grammar of our language keeps us like right, then the grammar, the syntax would actually be malleable to our interpretation of the rule, and the rule itself would change. So we would have no way of understanding whether we are interpreting the rule correctly, or if there is even a correct way of interpreting it. Truth itself, reality itself, becomes so subjective that it actually is malleable to our own mental states. So language is actually decoding the world in such a way that allows a common sphere of existence, which is why Levinas says it gives, like, ethics is positive. It gives us an objective and common world. It gives us our freedom. And this is why I would argue that, like, beings like us, like, who have higher order consciousness, higher order consciousness in the sense that, like, it's linguistic, we have present at hand states. And these present at hand states allow us to interact with the world in such a way in which we can exist without being in this very moment. We can understand time and the totality and continued existence of our being, right? And that's a linguistic construct. It's give us like so much. We can hold ourselves as an object, right? But the only way that we could do that is through communication. Now, these concepts are what are giving us the world in the first place. And when you disregard those concepts, you are disregarding what is giving you yourself, which is why Hegel is arguing that it is the rejection of subjectivity itself. You are entering, by acting in caprice, you're actually rejecting who you are.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I guess this is probably just where we're fundamentally disagreeing. Like, I see language as just purely a means of one ape to signal something of general use to another ape, but that it doesn't have any meaningful bearing on reality or it's not shaping anything. It's just a crude tool at navigating it, but doesn't have any sort of meaning beyond that. So like when we talk about, morality and like what it means to be moral and stuff, like I do just think that that's all basically a giant word game, and that there that at the end of the day our language is going to break down. Just our descriptions of what self is, what individuals are, it all breaks down, and the only thing we can hope for and act towards. Of course, I don't even believe in free will, so like
Well,
how
like,
much of this language even makes sense? But that there's objectively there's objective states of the world that are, you know, more pleasurable. There's objective states that are less pleasurable, and we can move towards the good ones and away from the bad ones. But trying to derive any sort of meaning, you know, ethics, I guess you could say, ends up kind of empty,
you see,
on my
like,
view.
well, like, okay, but what you'd be arguing for then is like that there must be an innate language which gives us these universals such as pain, pleasure, um, you know,
I don't think we need a language for that. I think when I put my hand on a hot stove, I don't think it matters what words I attach to that
no,
or
but it
not.
does when you think about how you are going to act within the future, right? You need to understand that experience as being being interrelated with another experience, right?
In
That's what.
pragmatic terms, yeah. So again, though, I agree that language is this sort of pragmatic tool that we can use to navigate from good experiences to bad ones, or bad ones to good ones. But I don't think that says anything about whether, you know, certain states of the world are better than other ones.
Well, like, look at it like this. This is the thing. Like, the value is implicit within the categorization in the first place. That's how we have been able to categorize it, right? Like, you are given the value, but as in, like, you are given the positive or negative feature of the world, but your ability to understand the world pragmatically and appreciate your how you should behave, that is based upon that, under that categorization of interconnected events, which shows the similarity of each event to an experience you've had in the past or in the future, which is why, like, or will have in the future. Like look at it like this. Like, it's like Locke even says, like, our what we consider our universals are actually derivative of particulars which are connected together, which led, like, for example, you wouldn't understand a line as straight. You wouldn't understand this idea of a notion of the most perfectly straight line. That's not within your mind. What you have is an experience of a variation of lines, and what we call straight is built of particular events,
Yeah.
in which we have seen, like, straighter and straighter lines, and we understand that bent is in relation to, like, you know, this curve and this and what it is, this object of our experience. Now, that can only be the case if we are able to make categorizations. Now, it's how we make those categorizations. They're the rules of the language. They aren't given to you, because if they were given to you, right, then we would be seeing that you would have an innate universal. And what I would suggest is reading John Locke, Essays on Human Understanding, and his rejection of Cartesian intrinsic knowledge. Because that's where you're
Yeah.
that's where you're at. That's where you're saying that there would be an intrinsic knowledge of what pain entails, but clearly it's not.
Yeah.
Like, you don't, like, a child does not understand, like, pain simpliciter. They understand a moment of pain, and that's why, like, in the future, like, we understand we can characterize more broadly on pain in something like there is emotional pain, there is physical pain, and those are actually captured in the experience of pain. And, like, we can be more specific, or we can be more general. And this is how we, you know, like, it will. If I was to say, like, the negative utility of the world will increase or decrease, what I'm actually compounding together is a multiplicity of concepts that have been built up through life as an individual who has experienced individual particulars. And not only that, I'm also drawing off the experience of others for the moments in which I have not experienced, because otherwise I would have to feel the pain of electrocution before I knew it would be painful to be electrocuted. I have associated myself with the individual to such a degree that I understand that their negative phenomenological experience and use of the word is similar to mine, and that is the rule, like, whether we are using words correctly. And so we are totally reliant upon individuals for gaining this, like, appreciation and knowledge of the world and understanding, like, how we should act. Otherwise, saying like smoking will cause me pain would be ridiculous because you can't conceptualize your own future unless you're basing it upon something else. And that would be
Yeah.
the past of other people who would be you in the future.
Right. So, but that whether or not we can sort of conceptualize, the things that cause pleasure and pain, like electrocution or whatever, like those are just contingent facts about our biology or whatever. I could imagine a being that would get pleasure from being electrocuted or whatever. Like
Yeah, you
so,
could, like you totally could. But why would that not be, that wouldn't fit the categorization of a human? Like you would say like, okay, so like this electric being that actually ate electricity, like loves being electrocuted, man. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, he's like the Iron Man or something, you know what I mean? He's,
Yeah.
he's having a great time. But
Yeah.
you can make a rational guess that what you are and the object of your experience is actually not that. You can say
Right.
you're a human and you understand your nature in relation to other individuals because you are given a recognition of yourself from the view of other individuals, which are verified, biological facts about reality, which
Yeah.
you would be incapable of giving verification of. It's like otherwise you'd be just as likely without these other individuals to characterize yourself as an electric eating alien and act in caprice and kill yourself. So like the point is that you are totally reliant on the expression of your subjectivity upon the characterizations other people give of the world. And it is this combination of phenomenological experience that gives us the categorizations that can let us have concepts like even the self in the first place. We aren't given that as a moment of reality, because what the self isn't just the feeling and consciousnesses in the world. It's the ability to understand yourself as what you are and who you are and how you will act and the time in which you live and those things that influence your actions in the first place, that allow you to change what I would call what is called in philosophy as second order desires. So you understand the system of drives in the words of I think Hegel. And that can only be given to you if you're understanding yourself in a way that was as if you were hovering over your own existence. Now that's an objective view, and that distance could only be achieved with another individual, because otherwise you are permanently attached to the present, the totality of your existence. And this is why like you are given temporal experience from language. I mean, like a good I think like Wittgenstein is a good place to look for that.
But still, these are at base just pragmatic concerns, because most animals or whatever don't have a conception of self or any of these things, but things can still matter or not to them.
Okay, but that doesn't make them moral agents, though, does it? That makes them morally considerable, but that doesn't give them moral agency.
Yeah. So I guess I just don't so much care about moral agency at all, because I just fundamentally kind of deny agency to begin with.
But I mean, like, well, what I would say is that when we talk about these things, what we talk about is the freedom of the will being, the self in this regard, like the will being a rational entity which isn't coming into contradiction with itself. So by being rational and appreciating and acting in such a way, what we are doing is relieving the irrationalities of us implicit within our being. Now that doesn't require a level of actual libertarian freedom. At best it would be it would be something much more close to maybe compatibilism. But even in a hard determinist sense, what we're talking about is one faculty of mind being the dominant feature of our existence, and that's what we need. We should try and propagate that, because we are that faculty. Now, to reject that would be to say that we can't act otherwise. But even if we say that we couldn't act otherwise, and we would so let's say we enter a fatalist position, it seems that by entering that fatalist position within our minds, we would be influencing our actions. So it seems that regardless of whether we're actually ultimately determined or not, clearly what we are doing right now has impact. So what we should do is try and bring around the greatest possibility of good within even our totally determined state, because that is what we are. And that might trying to convince you that might all be like, an expression of epistemic, epiphenomena. What's it called? Yeah. And
Epiphenomena, yeah.
and that might just happen, but the point is that through my appreciation of the good, which is inherent to my being, it is what should happen, and should in an axiomatic way. It's like a functional concept. It's like the good watch is the watch that tells the time, and that's what I'm talking about. Like achieve the function of your life, which is implicit to your being, which you do not get to choose, and that requires rationality and rational justification towards your actions. Now, you don't get to do any of this, but that's essentially what you must do.
Yeah. I probably wouldn't call it fatalism. So like when I think of fatalism, I think of this sort of like, what is it, Hamlet or whoever, where it's like, you're going to end up killing your mom or killing your dad and marrying your mom no matter what you do.
Oedipus and all that, yeah. And
and so like literally no matter what action you take, it's going to end up at that result. So like I don't think that's what's going on. I think the could not have done otherwise is just more just kind of straight hard determinist incompatibilism. That like I think we are just stuff that's happening. We are experiences of the world. So maybe it doesn't even really make sense to talk about like things in the way of like, well, you should do this. Like maybe we're all just kind of just describing everything and not really prescribing.
Maybe we are, but it's that description which is ultimately part of the phenomena or experience of the world itself, isn't it? Like, it's like, this is why, like, it, like for example, it's in a Hegelian sense, the progression of the will is inherent. It's the pressure of history. We don't do it, but we are it. We cannot help but do it. We must do it. And it is that's the point in what I'm getting at. The reason you are given yourself, but by a rational construct. You aren't born with like Vincent in your head, and right. Vincent is actually the product of history, and that history is the resolution of subjective conflict within beings. And so what I'm arguing for is that resolution. Like, I'm not giving you really anything other than yourself.
Yeah. And I guess to that, I guess I just don't understand what the upside is to doing that, to that exercise. Like,
because like the exercise itself, if it's the inevitability of history of the will correcting itself, then what you like, it's what you are is the appreciation of the concepts which give you the world in such a way that lead to the reduction of suffering for yourself and others throughout history. You're part of that process. You are the process. And when you don't take part of that process, what you do is reject yourself. And one of the reasons we'll punish you in the first place is to either not only remove you from society and remove your influence, but to show that this is a contradiction of who we are, what we are, and how we behave.
Yeah. So I guess I just look at things through would the world be better if I accepted myself instead of rejected myself, or would it, or not? And like all else being equal. So let's, you have two states of the world that are exactly the same, pleasure over pain. It is the fact that I'm rejecting myself actually making the world any worse? No.
Well,
so
I mean, like,
why care about it? Like, so why bother?
I understand why you're saying that, but like, let's say you were rejecting yourself. One, like, a rejection of self can lead to any action at all. It's total caprice, right? So like, you could go and murder someone, and there would be nothing.
So it's instrumentally valuable. I can understand that.
But but in the sense that it's like, I would not say that like the self was intrinsically valuable. Like what sometimes people call the self of selves. I'm getting at. The self of selves is intrinsically valuable. Like, that's like, that's not Vincent. That's the, like, in the words of like the Buddhists, like, that's like the, what is it, like the, essentially what do they call, like the sticks meeting at the point of experience. You are the point of like the experiences coming together, and that's given to you. But like the self is the ability to direct that experience, and because the self of selves is valuable, the self is valuable. If you understand what I'm saying.
So why
It
intrinsically valuable?
extrinsically,
Yeah, I'm not following. Okay,
extrinsically valuable.
okay,
Like if I was to, let's say I was to ego death Vincent, right? Vincent's
yeah.
gone, right? And we were to replace him with another consciousness. They would have the same moral value. Like you could have a stroke, and like go through this like weird procedure or whatever, and you could lose all of your memories. You could learn yourself from scratch in a totally new environment. You would be a
Uh,
totally different human being. You would still have the same moral value. Like that's intrinsic to the pain
I
pleasure responses that you would have.
yeah, I think I'm just denying that there can be an ego death because there isn't really an ego at the bottom
Out
of
of, I
anything.
mean, like you see, I disagree. Like you can't deny. Um, I don't think you can deny the what personality is, and I think personality is the conceptual association with yourself and other concepts within the world which allow you to hold yourself as an object. It's not like this is intrinsically value and it is giving the world it's not giving you the phenomenal experience of the world. What it's doing for you is characterizing the phenomenological experience in such a way that it allows you to make decisions. And without it, you could not make decisions. Now, that's why, like, I would say if you were to destroy your ego and do something like what Nietzsche did, then you would go mad, like Nietzsche did. Like, he went through a process of, propagating those Dionysian values where he said you should not live through any given concept, and because of that it was a rejection of logic, and the rejection of logic is the rejection of your mind. It's the rejection of what you are. And like in a Wittgensteinian sense, like you should understand that you have no option but to think logically. So if you did manage to contradict that logic in your head, what you are destroying is your ability to actually act within the world in a quote unquote meaningful way. You've destroyed meaning for yourself.
So, I'd follow you to the extent that, like, you have to be organized in some sort of ego to operate functionally in the world at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably why we did evolve this sort of sense of self, because anybody who probably didn't have that sense of self didn't last too long.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
But
like not necessarily, because I mean, you could say that it was like semantic as well. Like people could make you could operate semantically, and people do this with animals all the time. And they say like actually it could be reactive, and you wouldn't need you could have a reflexive process. But but the difference is that
it wouldn't work as well,
yeah,
though.
yeah. What it gives us is the ability to question the experiences that we are having against another experience, which allows us to make categorizations, which give us this freedom. But by freedom, what we mean is not being caused inherently by ourselves, and as in purely by the desires that were given to us from birth. Like the desire for sex, the desire for food, the desire for all of these different things. We can reject all of those and choose another desire. But we cannot reject desire, which is why we are determined. But also doesn't mean that we're not in this place of absolute nihilism where we are destroyed our ability to act within the world and so have no freedom at all. We still have a self, and the expression of that self and the subject is its abidance with the concept of language and that which is within it in the first place. And that is what increases the positive phenomenological experience for the common, the people, the universe as you would understand it, because it allows us to propagate and act in such a way where we understand a pleasure-pain relationship with the world, within beings and other beings and so on, and allow us to act to maximize that categorization of desire and the desirable.
Yeah, so I guess I haven't thought too deeply about this, but I guess my first reaction would be that I think self is a sensation that like our brains are like giving to us, and not like a metaphysical reality. That
Well,
that there are places in the world, loci, like namely, inside our skulls, where this sensation of self is kind of manifesting, but that there's no coherent static identity of selfhood. Yeah, that's how I'll put it.
I can see why you'd say that. Like, it's idea that like essentially but like it is the identity which gives us the ability to act within the world in the first place. Because like if you weren't using the concepts of language, then you wouldn't have any ability to categorize the world, and you would be totally reliant upon those instinctual urges in the first place. So what I'm saying is the self is this living through concepts. Your subjectivity is the idea of being a subject within a collective group of subjects in the first place, which is why being irrational is to reject the concepts which give you freedom. And that's, you be rejecting that which you are, who you are, which is rejecting the maximization of the good, which you implicitly desire because of what you are.
Isn't isn't that at bottom just kind of a word game though? Like that's
How?
kind of like we've defined the self in this way or whatever, but like if you were looking at the universe through this sort of Laplace's demon slash God's eye view of things, you wouldn't actually see anything called a self. You would just see, stuff bouncing
Subjects.
around.
You would just see subjects. You would see something that was like feeling pain or pleasure, like positive and negative phenomenological experience. Yeah, fair enough. But we don't have that option. We don't have that option though. Like, but that option. This is why Hegel actually says like what we are moving towards is that option through the evolution of self, because the evolution of self gives us the common will, right? Like the common will is this like notion of understanding our behaviors to like create this interaction pragmatically with the world, as you say. And as these concepts evolve, we move towards a resolution of the self understanding the self, which is why Hegel's arguing that there is only one self understanding itself through time, but it understands itself through our experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I just I'm a little bit squirrely with the definition of self, but like I just like I don't know. This probably ends up backing all the way up into like sort of argument about what consciousness is and stuff. But like, I'm just seeing consciousness as this sort of information processing, and I'm not sure how slapping a sort of identity onto that
Okay, let us give it
makes
like
much
this.
sense.
Processing's a good word. So if you are given
Yeah.
a process in which implicitly gave you the world, let's say using like somewhat the intrinsic language which decodes the world, we'll not call it a language because I confused someone I debated recently. We'll say like the phenomenological experience which you are given, and those drives and stuff that are like subconscious. Let's say we just relied upon that. Well, then we would have there would be no such thing as utility and maximizing. There'd be no such thing as ethics. But what ethics is the understanding of categorizations within the world, and what the self is the understanding of you as a subject in relation to them, and as an object of experience itself. Not all of the experience, but only a single part of experience. You can only have that universal view once you accept concepts. I mean, like that's the ironic part of it. To reject the conceptualization and language of the world, you would be rejecting your ability to see the big picture. You'd be seeing a particular picture. This is why Hegel sees it as the creation of a universal concept, and that's why he says like man needs to recognize that God did not create man, but that man creates God.
Yeah. I think that rests on the assumption though that like somehow you would need to be able to see the whole universe for for what it is, this God's eye view. I Even if God's eye view is like not possible without this sort of self, that doesn't seem to matter whether there are actually objective states in the world. You don't need a God's eye view for there to be things to be viewed. I'm not sure how well I worded that, but
No, I know what you're saying. Like, I know exactly. Like, we wouldn't be able to deny the phenomena of our experience, um, if, regardless of our appreciation of language, like it would be it's inherent
yeah,
to our being. That's the whole point
yes,
of the end of
yeah,
Descartes' whole like thought experiment of like doubt. The end of Cartesian
yeah,
doubt
yeah,
is
yeah,
to recognize like it's undoubtable. Existence is
yeah,
undoubtable,
yeah,
and an experience and qualitative experience is undoubtable. So yeah, like I completely agree there, but it's how you would understand that experience which is doubtable. Like everything up to that point is doubtable, and what in that experience you have is totality, and this idea of infinity, which is this breach of an
mm,
understanding of a common world, is what what it means to be objective. Like it means to not be determined by the implicit knowledge you are given, and instead be determined by what is the verified knowledge of all experience. It's to accept that that there is an objective world outside of the self in which we operate and behave within. And unless we accept like language, we are not given that. And when we accept language, we are given a way to see the world in this objective world, in this plane of existence, in which
gotcha.
we can, make judgments and rationalize about our lives. And okay, so then we can fulfill that which is implicit within us, which is desire, because we cannot doubt that desiring. We cannot doubt our movement towards the positive and away from the negative. That
Yeah,
is within our being. Like we would have ran from fire without the knowledge of what the word fire means, but with the word fire, we know how to prevent it.
yeah, yeah. I guess um, I'm just not sold on the intrinsic importance of understanding the world. So you may well be right that like in order to understand the world you need this certain conception of self and et cetera, et cetera. But like I'm not convinced that like that sort of understanding is important at all. And I'm thinking it's just sort of an artifact of our biological limitations of understanding things. Maybe stuff can't really be understood in the way that it really is.
Hmm.
I mean, all of reality is so that like you've got
Infinite.
these. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you've got this incredibly complex, just sort of arrangement of matter, and you've got this sort of like these Higgs fields and like all this crazy stuff, and like who knows where it even actually bottoms out. Like it maybe string theory is right and everything's actually just a bunch of these vibrating strings and stuff. Like who knows where it bottoms out. And maybe not only, and I don't know, but maybe not only are we like sort of biologically computationally limited in understanding that, but like even in theory you can't like what we mean by understand you can't do about the universe. Maybe that's the case. I don't know, but that
You
doesn't seem
see,
to me important into determining whether one state of the world is better than the other. And that's all I ever mean by morality or moral progress is moving towards more pleasure and away from suffering. And even if our understanding of that is just this crude sort of rule of thumb primate way of doing it that bottoms out in some sort of logical contradiction, um, like that's okay. I'm just willing to like kind of bite that bullet and say, yeah, okay, like it bottoms out in a contradiction. So what?
like what I think, like if I can maybe like try and put this in such a way that it would help. Like imagine this. like obviously I've said that like our conceptions of the world are limited. Now, yes, I think that we have to accept a fallibilist view of knowledge. Like perfect knowledge is impossible, but what we understand knowledge to be is what is probable, and what is most probable is that which contains the least contradictions, and so it has the least chance of relevant falsehood and greatest chance of being verified. That which can be verified and falsified and has the least falsification is the most true and is the most appropriate concept that we can apply to the world. Now, that we can apply to the world is the words that I would use there, because the limits of selfhood give us the limits of our conceptualization of the world. Like the language in which I'm capable of using and which the grammar is actually functions gives me the limits of my understanding and reasoning. Like it is true that I could never have perfect absolute knowledge because who I am is incompatible with that, because my like the logic, the reasoning, the concepts that have given me would fall in direct contradiction with that better conceptualization of the world, because it would replace who I am. Like if I was raised in an environment in the future, it's more likely than not that my understanding of things like physics, mathematics, English, whatever it is, would grow with the complexity of the concepts that are given and taught to me as a child. And which is why like ethics improve over time. This is moral progress, and why like scientific progress occurs in the first place, because what it is a progression of the reduction of contradictions. Now, okay, yeah, like that would be the limits of our epistemics of individually. Like we can only go so far, but we should go as far as we can, because that is how we will eventually, and I say we in this broad term, what I mean is like if we were to take it on this understanding of the objective, the universal will, the phenomenological experience that we are categorizing from will reach its ultimatum of absolute knowledge. But by absolute knowledge anyway, like I don't necessarily mean like ultimate understanding that can never be breached, because that would require a constant conceptualization of the self, which is like the prime mover. He constantly understands himself, like this idea that he conceives himself, and because he conceives himself he changes because he's himself, and so he constantly is in this propagated experience of the infinite. Now that's what I would say truth as being. Truth is the journey towards truth, and not absolute knowledge in itself. So like what you
important to whether, like, we might never know or even be able to conceptualize what the best possible state of affairs is, but that doesn't change that there is a best possible state of affairs, or that we're moving closer or further away from it.
Well, the point is that what we are reliant upon is epistemic justification, and I think that's something that I think like epistemic realism is reliant upon logic itself, and that cannot be doubted. Now, like if you want to doubt logic, you just end up one in what Kant calls a whirlpool, and two, it's implicit within our minds and in who we are in the first place. So the only way you could doubt it is to destroy yourself, and then you wouldn't have an option to think in the first place. So yeah, like that's pretty much my argument against that. But I think more so, like, let's say you did do that, then the overall experience of the being which you are, which is not necessarily Vincent, would decrease, because your predictive capabilities would decrease, meaning that you could propagate behaviors that will cause you suffering more likely, because you lack the probabilistic nature of the concept, which is given you.
Yeah.
Like the world itself.
No, I totally understand. This strikes me as like just a purely pragmatic argument. Like,
100%. Like, but like, okay, yeah, like pragmatics, but like you cannot deny it. Like, it's necessitated.
Sure. Yeah. Then I'm just not so sure where we're disagreeing, because
what I'm saying is that like if you don't be vegan, if you don't act in such a way that propagates the concept of right, and veganism is an expression of that concept and a growth on equality, then what you are doing is you are rejecting the expression of your own subjectivity, and the rejection of that subjectivity leads to undesirable consequences, and so you are necessitated by the function of your being to drive towards veganism.
Yeah, I mean, pragmatically, you should be a vegan if what you want to see is, or if what you want is to sort of have some kind of impact, probabilistically, because like obviously individuals don't have, conclusive sway one way or the other. But that's still just that still depends on there actually being some sort of causal efficacy in moving veganism or animal rights in the direction that you want to go with it. So like, again, I understand like you have some kind of a platform to do this, and even just influencing family members might have some kind of influence, but I guess I just doubt that that any yeah, sorry, I don't know how to put this really, that doesn't just end up back where we were.
I was going to say, I think what you're going to say essentially is that you're not convinced that the individual can affect the overall consequences of reality because of the almost minute changes that they make towards the world. Now, obviously, what I would say is that, and you agreed, is that the collection of individuals is what, does make the difference. And
yeah,
that the only reason that those individuals act in a certain way, and the only way that we can be guaranteed that we are acting in the right way, is to follow the concept right. And that's the concept we must follow at all times. So we do not choose. We cannot, if we were to choose to act any other way than to be vegan, then we will be more probabilistic in propagating suffering. And the only way that we can say that we are not is because we are increasing the probability that our actions, we know that these actions are justified, whilst other actions lack said justification, and the effect of our group actions will have a consequence. So the individual, like you talk about the individual rejecting themselves, that is selflessness.
Yeah. So I think then again though, and this is why I tailed off at the end. I was trying not to just dive right back into this. It's just we end up right back at the disagreement of whether there is a significant probabilistic reason to do this or that. And but I mean like I think you rightly say that it's probabilistic, but like at what point do the probabilities not justify the action? Like, so if the odds are 1 in 10 trillion, then obviously your time is better spent elsewhere. But if your odds are 1 in 2, then okay, that seems like so like you have to sort of grade what you're doing in these probabilities. And I don't think just saying, well, it's probabilistic really gets rid of the problem, because then it's like, okay, then at what point are the probabilities no longer worth it?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, but the point is that the only thing that you'll be justified in doing and have an understanding of the probabilities in the first place is towards that given conception of right. Anything else is arbitrary. It doesn't actually appreciate. You say your time would be better spent doing something else, but there would be no way of actually gaining that knowledge. That's the point. So the only way that you can be knowledgeable about your actions is to appreciate the concept of right in the first place. And so you should act within that concept, because if you don't act within that concept, then you are increasing the probability, or at least not maximizing the probability of the better consequences. Yeah, it's not a choice between option A and option B. There is only one option, and that is the concept.
But I think the chances of just doing nothing are probably just like, if they're any worse. So like at accomplishing the end of animal welfare or whatever, I'm just saying that like doing nothing, I think has about the same chance of changing the state of affairs in a meaningful way as well, I mean, like, because it's just like saying, well, 1 in a trillion is better than nothing is, I mean, I guess that's true, but that's only trivially true. Like,
Well, is there anything trivial in this? That's the whole point. And two, like it's ethics. Nothing can be trivial. But the second thing I'd say is that like this is this isn't a question necessarily just about whether or not it will bring around the consequences you wish it to bring around, but it's a question about how you should act within the world in ethics itself. Let's say you choose not to act. Well, we know that if you reject logic and reason, well, then you are going to be increasing your likelihood of suffering. And the greatest acceptance of logic and reason will reduce the likelihood of suffering and maximization of pleasure. Now, what we are saying here is that because veganism is a fringe movement, or because it's because it's not necessarily done by everyone, then it never will be done by everyone, or that it like your
no, I think
actions.
it could be.
Well,
I'm
then,
hopeful that it will
well
be.
then, but what I'm saying is that you being a vegan is either an acceptance of who you are as Vincent and the logical construction within your mind, or you are rejecting it and are determined to an existence of frustration. Like, look at it like this. Have you ever read Plato's Gorgias?
No,
Uh,
I haven't.
it's
I'm
really
not
good.
I'm not big into Plato,
Oh,
but go ahead.
I don't like late Plato, right? I think he's a dick. But like the early Plato, which is basically like more based on Socrates, that's great, right? And I think I've got a quote here in it, which is, well, I know bollocks to that. Essentially, it's just the understanding of this relationship between good and bad. Like he presents to Callices or whatever, a thought experiment that I'm going to present to you. Is it better to be the brave man, or is it better to be the coward? Okay. Now, first he says this: who experiences the greatest desire to defeat their foe, the brave man or the coward? Now, I think it's inherently true that the coward would experience the greatest desire to defeat their foe, because the coward has the greatest fear in relation to the foe. So the removal of that negative has the greatest overall drive within the coward. But that drive is also that drive also creates suffering. Like, to desire is to suffer. Like, for example, what you were talking about, like with Buddhism, desiring itself is a form of suffering. It's a frustration within the world in which you try and achieve an overall aim. Now, then what he said that the brave man, who will experience the greatest satisfaction at defeating their foe? And he says, well, surely it's the coward. The coward will feel the greatest pleasure in the end. So if pleasure was the basis in which we did anything, then we would surely maximize. If we were maximizing pleasure alone, then we would say that you should be the coward. If we are maximizing the pleasure-pain relationship within the individual, then we should say you should be the brave man. Now, we cannot know for certain that the brave man will be better off at killing their foe, or will definitely feel less fear, or maybe the coward's motivation actually increases his likelihood of survival marginally, which lets him survive, something like that. Some things that are epistemologically unverifiable or unfalsifiable. But what we do know is that the suffering that is felt by the coward is something that we wish to avoid. And it comes to a greater degree than the satisfaction that we would achieve from ending another's life. And so this is why you would say that pleasure is not the end of it. It is the pleasure-pain relationship. And that's a categorization in how we understand ourselves as either a coward or a brave man. And that this categorization is what we are accepting when we act within the world. It's not like we aren't necessarily choosing our actions just because of our actions. We are choosing ourselves and who we wish to be. And that is based upon a rational relationship, as a rational conceptualization of what the good life for man is.
So, I mean, I'd probably agree that that is how we, in fact, do things, but maybe not so much that that's how they should be done. Or, but also, I mean, not to nitpick with the thought experiment, but it's like I could conceive of either person in either position getting way more pleasure or pain or nothing at all from whatever they're doing. I mean, I
Okay,
understand
but how
like
would
under
they?
typical psychologies,
Yeah, but
but
this is the thing. Like, but how would they understand that whether they would or not? This is the point. Like, they can only understand themselves in relation to the concepts in which they can apply to their own existence, which give them the categorizations of life in the first place. So they are at some point going to have to apply reason. Now, what I'm saying is that more reason and the better application of reason will give you a better notion of self, which will give you the best expression of subjectivity within the world, and that is the conceptualization of what we can epistemically verify. Anything else is induced, and you've already assumed the conclusion, which is why Ayn Rand says that, like, if you assume happiness, you cannot just assume what happiness is. Happiness is something in which you must deduce for yourself. If you think that, like, for example, taking drugs will make you happy, and you end up as an addict, you can clearly see that you are mistaken in that induction in the first place. You've come to a conclusion without justification. But if you were to, understand yourself in such a way that your biology was so, like, we understood biology and everything, we understood that you could not physically get addicted, well, then your expression of self would be better. And yeah, take the drugs or whatever, because you know the outcome to a greater degree. But that relies upon this expression of reason.
but I actually don't think it takes any understanding or reason to experience pleasure or
Oh no,
pain.
no, not the experience, but the
Like you could,
understanding of it.
but I mean, then this is just going to go back to like eh, pragmatic reasons aside. I don't think it's important that you understand. Like, I don't think it's important whether or not a mouse understands pleasure or pain, but just the only thing that is important is whether or not it's feeling it, or like, um,
What about
like
it? Like, I'll give you a couple of scenarios that this can change things. Like, so for example, let's say the mouse, like, understood pleasure and pain and its relationship to know that it shouldn't bite an electrical cord. Like, that's the
yeah,
pragmatics of it, right? But let's
yeah.
say let's say that it had a linguistic concept of self which gave it temporal existence, which I would argue language does, because that's a conceptualization which ties experience together. It's psychological continuity and this concept of I, which we've internalized in the first place, right? And because of that, and that's like a Wittgensteinian argument, and because of that, like, we can get philosophies such as Stoicism, which, during the moment of feeling pain, you could imagine yourself in a conceptual garden, and so your awareness would not be based upon just the phenomenological experience of that is given to you, but rather than a conceptualization of a world in which you can experience in your own mind. Your imagination is given to you from language. And this is the point. Like, you can exist in a state of being which is then present at hand, and you can change the way in which positive and negative phenomenological structures actually affect your experience. And this is why people meditate, for example, because they are changing. By meditating, they are placing themselves in an environment which changes their neurochemistry, and you can see this,
Right.
like,
Right, right.
and
Yeah,
so you
yeah.
are giving yourself somewhat an experience anyway, like not giving yourself the experience in this, like, grand notion of, creatio ex nihilo, but what you are
Yeah.
doing is you are using concepts to necessarily distance yourself from reality. Now, this can have the inverse effect as well, which is the important point of, like, how you actually act, and which would be, where you put your awareness in this scenario. And this is why, like, something like Hegel says Stoicism's the unhappy consciousness, leads to an unhappy consciousness, and blah blah blah. But the essentially, you could, like, it's like when Seneca says, what is it, we suffer far more in our imaginations than we do in reality. We've opened up the whole door from an ideological suffering. You can now, like as before, you could have went through your day and you wouldn't understand that Donald Trump was president, and that mightn't hurt you, right? But then you might really now understand the concepts of Donald Trump and so on. So there's a whole other plane of experience which you can
Right.
have pain and pleasure responses from. So that
Right.
it does change the phenomenological experience. This is the point. But more than that, it allows you to understand how you will behave in not in now all of those realms. And that is what you're reliant upon. When you choose yourself, you are choosing, how you will behave in the world, how you will use this, like, how you will you'll choose your second order desires, and these are the movement of action urging, processes, which then ultimately help probabilistically determine where you'll end up and where this consciousness and this experience of the world will be. And so when you reject the concepts which can create yourself, you are rejecting not only a whole plethora of experiences, but your ability to maximize the well-being suffering ratio within that experience.
But what if I just said, okay, don't be a vegan, just jump in the experience machine, sit there and like feel pleasure for forever.
Okay, so the experience machine, that's a good one. That's given by, like, Robert Nozick talks about this in Anarchy, State and Utopia, but he says that individuals have a direct pleasure-pain relationship with their knowledge of interacting with reality. But if you were to tell me this, right, and like some people will just call it status quo bias, but if the experience machine, entering it would only be moral if we could use the rational categorizations of desire, and those rational categorizations of desire are not individual and so must include more than one individual, which is why you could be in the experience machine and feel the desire to leave because you didn't think it was just that other people were feeling suffering and you weren't doing anything about it. This is like, there's a book called, like, it kind of does this as a thought experiment. I'll see if I can find it.
But notice though, that's only if you know that you entered the experience machine. What if you would enter it and you were, your memory from before was erased, and now you just thought you were in this perfectly pleasurable utopia and you didn't know the difference.
Well, okay, if you didn't have knowledge and all you had was experience, like, rather than having a concept of self and all you had was experience.
Well, you could keep the subjective self experience or whatever, but I'm just saying you don't know that there's people outside of your.
Okay, yeah, but then, like, then you should always do what you think, or like you can, like, epistemically prove to be right. And so if you have limited knowledge, your duties are limited. Or it implies can. And obviously can here is related to, like, that which you know and can direct your experience towards. So, like, you don't unplug yourself from the experience machine if you only have the knowledge that it will implicitly cause suffering. But because of what you are, let's say the people start talking within the experience machine and they recognize that there could be suffering, then you would have an obligation to leave. And if you didn't, then you would start feeling, guilt and the negatives of that. And it would
but that's only once you're already in it. I'm saying like what if you have the choice? You could say, I can go vegan, or I can jump in this experience machine where I know I'll feel zero doubts of being it. It'll just be perfect utopia or whatever. So much of what I've heard is that the reason to be a vegan is because you're sort of like to do otherwise would sort of deny yourself, and it would pragmatically lead to negative experiences or what have you. But if you have this option to just bail, I'm not sure what the downside is for you in that situation, or why you should be compelled to veganism.
Okay, so first, like, what you're saying is that, like, why you should be compelled to veganism and why you shouldn't just bail. The first, you wouldn't have any way to epistemically verify that you would be feeling, this overall goodness, and that's what it is, because what goodness isn't an individual concept. Like, this is the point, like, your way of understanding the world ceases to become an individual, it starts to become a we. This is why ethics is not, when it gives you the subject, It's only through recognition from another subject in which we create and construct our subjectivity in relation to each other, which is why, we have this problem of authenticity, because we think we are who we are in our heads, but in reality, we are actually a construction between individuals in the first place from outside of our heads and in a common plane of experience. But the thing is that we wouldn't have any, unless we could say that everyone should get in the machine. In which case, if everyone was going to get in the machine and maximize that, then what we should really do is maximize everyone getting in the machine. Our moral obligations become clear because it's in relation to what we can prove against each other. So if you were to say, should we put everyone in the experience machine, they will feel ultimate satisfaction. Yes, inherently, that is definitionally the case. But because definitions are constructed not individually, you could not know it would bring happiness, because happiness is not an individual notion, which is why eudaimonia is a better understanding of it, and eudaimonic flourishing.
So, okay, little bit confused, I suppose. So, you can't be happy unless the collective is happy?
You can't understand whether your actions will lead to happiness unless you use the concept of happiness simpliciter, which includes yourself and others.
But so let's say, but I mean, let's just say we have what amounts to like God standing next to you saying, yeah, you get in this machine, you will be I'm telling you.
Okay, but then what you've said like is perfect knowledge. Like that just that I mean can we acknowledge that at least
just have to
let's acknowledge that. I mean let's just first but the odds being better than not requires the rational decision making process of other individuals, right? That's the whole point.
Let's say 1,000 other people have done it, 1,000 people come out and say, man, that was the best thing of all time, you should do that. I mean we can set up the thought experiment.
But that's making a hypothetical. Like, it's like the idea of the difference between a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative, isn't it? Like, the logical predictive capabilities of a hypothetical concept is a particular, and it lacks the epistemic justification that is inherent in something like desire itself. And this is why, animals have moral consideration.
Yeah, I just don't know why the epistemic justification is important at all.
Because if we didn't have justification, if it wasn't for appreciation of reason and how we act, what you're arguing for is a half rational approach. If you act half rationally, you are at a greater likelihood of facing suffering because you have less reasons to understand that as actually in creating the positive probable existence that you want to get into. If you have a fully rational approach, then you are maximizing your ability to achieve that positive experience.
But except at the end of all this, the quote unquote fully rational approach has you staying out of the experience machine and missing out on all that pleasure. So yeah,
I mean, like first, like I would say that egoistic approaches are unfortunately, like it's just the reality of the situation. Like there will sometimes be, almost like tragic ignorance within humanity. Like we just don't have the knowledge that allows us to achieve the maximum ends for a given action. It's like that's why like someone like Foucault would say the ancient Christians could not have rejected slavery. But like that doesn't mean they shouldn't. That doesn't mean they shouldn't have, because it would have been in their interest to reject slavery. It just means that they lacked the concepts necessary to see that as the being the best solution, and that's just the reality of like the world we live. And more than that, it gives us as we improve these concepts, as we live through them and act through them and use reason within them, then we show the contradictions within them and then create better concepts which allow us to have a better experience of reality, a better probabilistic relationship with good and bad, pain and pleasure. And also, I think there's also an appreciation, in which Alistair McIntyre talks about, where he says like you can teach a child, right, chess by giving them a chocolate bar if they win, Okay, so you'll be saying, if you beat me at chess, I will give you a chocolate bar for every time you beat me at chess. And so they'll start playing the game of chess, but they won't have any appreciation for the game of chess, right? They have no appreciation for it. But through playing the game of chess, they begin to appreciate what chess is. They internalize chess as a game, and they come to value it in and of itself, the game. And what I'm saying is that the game within humans, within our language, which gives us ourselves, gives us the appreciation of self, simpliciter, which we would say that we don't just care about I don't just care about the feelings that I will have. I care about the feelings that others will have also.
But I don't think the kid is caring about the chess in itself. I think the chess is now giving that kid a kick of dopamine, and that's what the kid likes about it.
No, but but what is giving him that kick? The whole point is that if you're in the experience machine, right, if you have an appreciation for other people, then you will feel guilt in not being rational. Conscience then becomes the rejection of rationality, because you're rejecting who you are rejecting your reasoning in the first place, and you're rejecting the valuation of other people that is implicit within who you are and your understanding of them of having value, which has allowed you to even appreciate them and recognize them as someone who can judge your actions. Because if you didn't appreciate them as being able to judge your actions, then they wouldn't be able to epistemically verify your position in the first place.
But but I don't really see our moral obligations as having anything to do with whether everybody else are like moral agents. Like I think if everybody else on the planet was a rat, I would still have every obligation to maximize their well-being.
Yes, but you'd have no concepts necessary to understand how you would do that. The only reason that Vincent could do that is because of the concepts that he's internalized from childhood and developed through his life so far. So if we killed all of our humans, go and live a life in which you, to the best of your ability, have a concept of, increasing this, net well-being. You could rely upon those concepts which you've internalized. But if Vincent was thrown into the wild without these concepts and he rejected those concepts, then he started murdering rats because he thought life as a rat was so painful that it was better to just die, then you could see how that would increase the suffering within the world. You're not if you had it's about how you act. Ethics isn't about what necessarily happens and how it is described. I mean, it is, because that necessarily entails how we, try and achieve it, but in language. But ethics is about how we understand our behaviors and how we will try and achieve those things which are by definition good, bad, right, and wrong.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's the part that I'm probably not going to be able to hitch my trailer onto. But I mean, that's fine. we can just disagree about some things.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm going to ask you this, right? Before we move on, do you think you should become a vegan?
No, because I mean, obviously for reasons that I've articulated before, that I don't think it would actually save lives, and my more general sort of skepticism towards sort of moral epistemology, you could say, of just virtually no matter what I do, short of becoming, the leader of a country or whatever, I don't think long term, long range, the consequences of my actions are remotely predictable enough for me to try to figure out which ones are better than others. And so I'm going to try to be somebody who can have some sort of huge influence. But short of that, I'll probably just, I think I'm best off just living in a way that makes me comfortable. I mean, that might sound bad or whatever, but I just think, okay, go ahead.
obviously I'm going to say that you wouldn't know what that was with greater certitude, and that when you express veganism, what you are doing is you are accepting reason itself and its power over you in which you would use to achieve happiness. But more so, like, let's just double back. Like, you can obviously influence in a smaller way those around you, and even you said like the performance is clearly matters as well,
Yeah.
and people don't just listen to your words; they view your actions. And
Yep.
so, when you behave as a non-vegan, not only are you institutionally undoing like the behavior of vegans as a cultural norm, and so it becomes harder for veganism to propagate. But you're also undoing the like the slight changes that other individuals make in their behaviors, like another individual would make uh, economically, and um, you're not appreciating uh, that which you that which you are. And you can only do that if you understand that if you think you're a good person, if you want to be that good person, and inherently you have to want to be that good person, because a rejection of goodness would mean to condemn yourself to suffering, then you should
I think people
align
can do that.
you
I
should
think, yeah,
align your
but go ahead.
values. Sorry, then you must align your values with your actions. Otherwise, you'd exist in a state of cognitive dissonance, and you'll start feeling an expression of guilt. And now that guilt mightn't cause overwhelming angst, but you could relieve that, and you could also live a perfectly happy existence as a vegan. You can achieve, there's nothing that you would actually be giving up. I mean, you can eat everything pretty much as a vegan, as a non-vegan, like you would as a non-vegan. Like, you can eat burgers, you can eat I mean, what kind of stuff do you eat actually?
I have about the worst diet in the universe, so that maybe I shouldn't put that publicly in case I ever
Yeah.
file for life insurance or something. But
Well, like life insurance companies now recommend veganism. There's another thing. So
oh yeah, yeah, probably. So yeah, that my premiums would quadruple if I said what I eat on a daily basis.
Well, this is the thing. Like, you'd be reducing. Like, I mean, this is another facet of the conversation that we never went down. But do you not
Yeah,
think that the individual has a moral obligation towards their own health in relation to things like healthcare, in relation to the suffering of those around them that would have to, take care of them when they were older, or even towards
right.
themselves in the suffering of their own lives? Well, the plant-based diet, whole food plant-based diet, has been shown to reduce the risks of chronic disease considerably, and reduce all-cause mortality by 14%. So ultimately, you would be reducing the likelihood that you will suffer even in an individualist basis if you were to consume a plant-based diet. So would that not, like, overall be acting in your own best interest,
I
even
so
egoistically?
so yeah, so I actually think that that's the best argument for trying to get somebody to be vegan. Um, my problem my problem is that maybe I'm just a extremely short-sighted hedonist, but like eating food that I really enjoy is comprises at least like 75% of like why I find life meaningful. And I mean, well, I mean, whatever that says about my psychology, but uh, I I I don't really value longevity all that much. I think there's plenty of hip hop songs or whatever about not being here for a long time, but being here for a good time. Um, uh,
Well, I mean, like,
and
we're talking about a good time as well, because I mean, like, unless you
yeah,
think, having chronic disease is a bad time, I mean, a good time. Because I mean,
no, yeah.
like, imagine, like, for the last 10 years of your life that you are going to suffer in, like, horribly. Like, I mean,
Oh,
like,
I'm
the
fine
things
just
like,
calling it quits there and jumping off a bridge at that point.
but like, this is the point. Like, you're like, it is only through appreciation of reason and what value is that you can try and achieve it. Otherwise, you are propagating your chances of suffering in the first place. So you're not acting hedonistically. Like, also, look at it like this. Like, let's say someone had crippling anxiety. Actually, let's make it something else. Let's say they had a crippling phobia of, like, I don't know, like like other people or something, like, you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Agoraphobia. Yeah.
Yeah, like something like agoraphobia or something like I mean, my girlfriend has agoraphobia, so it's not nice. Would someone like that be better off staying in the house, or avoiding people, living a life in which they maximize the moment they live, and that given moment, or would they better off be challenging the psychology which gives them that pleasure pain relationship with the world, so that they could ultimately free themselves from the grips of that desire? Now, you see, I would say that they'd be better off challenging that psychology, and that's the whole point of what virtue ethics is. Do you want to be the brave man, or do you want to be the coward? Isn't necessarily saying it's going to be an easy process to become the brave man. You're not going to enjoy it so much, but that process is going to outweigh the suffering you will face when you are the coward. And that's the kind of point I'm getting at.
Yeah. So, well, to answer that specific question, I think that would just depend on the specifics of like the psychological condition. So like I don't know if with agoraphobia if it's better to just push your limits and like get over it, or if that's not possible and you'd just be subjecting yourself to torment. But with the diet thing's a little bit different, because you're sort of, with eating a bad diet, you're sort of like front loading the pleasures and then like pushing off the negatives, towards the later stages of life. You're cutting your life shorter. You're making the end of your life less enjoyable. But the thing is that like I just weight the earlier stages of my life a lot, like several times heavier than the end stage. Like one, because you don't know that you're going to get to the end stage, but two, just because, I mean, there's more you can do at this stage of life that is enjoyable, and so I think, I mean it's kind of like with the value of money. Like $1 a day is worth a lot more than $1, 20, 30 years from now.
Well, yeah, but like look at it like this. Do you think pension schemes are a bad idea?
No.
What about life insurance, or like having a bank account, or like, a lot of these things are temporal in nature, because what we are doing is appreciating the later points of life. And I think what you should do,
yeah.
I think what is rational in this situation, and I think it is the bias of your ego in the first place, like the bias of the nature of your being, which gives an appreciation of the immediacy of now, when really, rationally, you know that you will have to experience all of these potential moments of your life. And so, probabilistically, if you do live to 80, and you've lived the last, let's say, 15 years of your life, like, in absolute torment, then what you've done is you've given yourself a bad life. And you've willingly done that because you've rejected reason. Like, you're only half applying reason in the first place, because one, you know that these things will bring you, the only reason that you know these things will bring you happiness in the first place, at least momentarily, like, joy, elation, satisfaction, whatever it may be, is the consumption of these products. But even then, like, I would say that the propagation of desire within the moment is ultimately causing you this is why, for example, in the same thought experiment, like Plato's Gorgias, he says, he compares it to a barrel which is never full. Like, it's like a bucket that's never full, so it's like got holes in the bottom. If you desire is infinitely propagating. The more you desire, the more you will want to desire. And this is what Thomas Hobbes calls felicity, right? Because he says, like, when you try to satisfy your desire, you need more power to maintain that satisfaction, and so you desire another stage of power. Once you achieve that power, well, then you need more power to sustain that power, so you choose power again, and so you constantly propagate those desires. Now, what reason is the limitation of those desires in a given moment, so that you don't constantly propagate those desires, and desire itself is suffering. And so this is why, like, suicide rates and consumerist hedonism leads to, like, absolute suffering, and things like gluttony and so on. Like, nobody, like, you could see someone crying while eating. Like, don't get me wrong, like, they can enjoy the food, but overall their psychological well-being is that they're not even getting satisfaction from the food, because the moment they are eating the food, they know that it will end, and the knowledge that it will end is bringing them so much suffering in that moment that it's causing them more distress than it is to actually enjoy the food itself. Now, this is why you can't just hedonistically enter the world, because if you do that, then what you end up doing is propagating your own torture.
I agree that hedonism as a strategy is probably not, on average, very conducive to an actually hedonistic life. Yeah. I mean, like, obviously heroin, like, you can shoot up heroin and feel fucking great, and then you're fucking dead.
Yeah.
So I don't really dispute that it's generally not a great strategy to be focused on pleasure first and foremost. But I think I don't think that means it's never part of the equation. And I mean, look, you may well be right that over the span of whatever my life is, it turns out it would have been better had I eaten healthy. I mean that's fine. I mean, that's kind of just an argument for eating healthy. And maybe I am just being short-sighted, or maybe I'll get hit by a bus in 10 years and it'll be for my benefit that I ate like garbage.
Well, I mean, like
as
I said, don't get me wrong. Like the point is that this can have immediate side effects, like in the psychology of the individual, but also it can have, like, obviously the later understanding of yourself is to appreciate that the average lifespan of a member of our population is 80. So there is a good chance that you'll make it to 80, because especially with the advances of modern medicine, and so not to prepare from that is foolhardy. And like you even think, like you said, like, I'm happy to just jump off a bridge. Would you be? Like, you'll reach a certain part of your life and you're saying that you'll be happy to jump off a bridge. Well, all it implies can, and I can guarantee you that the hedonistic desire of what you're saying is that you're applying a level of like authority that you don't even have now. You're saying that you're willing to live a life of gluttony, of like expression of hedonistic desire in a given moment. Don't get me wrong, we all fail. Like we don't all eat good, like, and stuff like that. But I'm saying, like, the propagation of this life, like, you're saying that you do not have the will within you to propagate that better pleasure-pain relationship, but you will resolve that by having such a will later on that you're able to overcome all of your immediate desires, which hold the implicit desire for life, and that you'll be able to face existential crisis with no fear at all. And I think that's just absurd. Like, you're saying that you will get to the edge of that bridge and you will be like, no, it's fine. Like, I've totally knew that I was going to do this. Hey, like, you're not going to do that. Like,
so I think your advice is spot on for most people. I think most people who know me know I have about the most abnormal psychology you'll ever find, and I don't think that that sort of implicit drive for life exists. I think I will only exist so long as it's pleasurable to do so.
We can reject it. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, we can all reject like suicide's possible. Like, I'm not saying it's impossible.
Yeah.
Like,
no. But I'm saying, knowing my own psychology pretty well, I actually don't think I'll have as much of a problem just being like, well, had a good run. That's that. Now that I'm, diabetic and on dialysis and needing a heart transplant, like, I'm fine just exiting out at that point. And I think that would be psychologically easier for me than what you might expect. Now, I think you're probably right that, like, hey, most people, you should actually eat healthy and not front load all your pleasures and stuff. But I'm not sure that that's an absolute. I think there's people who are accepting.
Inherent contradiction in the idea of saying that you understand yourself to such a high degree that you know how your actions will behave, how you will behave in the future, regardless of, while you reject the reasoning in which gives you yourself in the first place. And so you think you know yourself, but you do not know yourself unless you are rational. And you aren't being rational, so what you are acting with is caprice in the first place. Like, you've already assumed that you will, and that's what it is. It's an assumption. Now, you might very well be right. There is a possibility that you do this in the future, but there is also a possibility that you are lying on your deathbed crying for a longer existence because the existential torment has now breached that hedonistic bubble of yours, and you plead for more life, and which most of us do, right? Like,
I think most people have a grimmer view of death than I do, but I don't find sleeping
like you do
particularly
right
miserable.
now. Well,
Yeah, but
like this is the point. Like it's like when Heidegger says that death gives you the possibility of impossibility, and that gives you angst. And there's a good chance it will give you this angst, but you're just not dealing with it because death is a possibility in the future, which means there's a good chance that you're trapped in the idle talk, and the idle talk, by definition, is the rejection of reasoning, which is preventing you from approaching the ontological investigation of your life in the first place. So what you're doing is you're not appreciating death as a possibility yet, and when you're saying that when I do appreciate death as a possibility, that my opinion of death won't change, even though you've finally been moved by the phenomenological experience of that negative, of that overall possibility of lack of subjectivity, which you inherently desire, which is why you are desiring right now as a hedonist.
The
irony of it all is this desire to move forward and maximize the pleasure of this given moment means that your death will be all the worse because you want the greatest satisfaction of your subjectivity, which is why you are moving forward in the first place, but you're also rejecting the way that you would get it, which is reason. So like there is contradictions within the whole like theory in my opinion.
Yeah, I tend to think people who are less reasonable actually probably are happier. That ignorance kind of is bliss for most people. But
well, is it like, look at it like this? Like, why is our society, for example, constructed in such a way that suicide rates are incredibly high? Do you think that ignorance is bliss, even though that most of our societal ignorance and political ignorance is causing and propagating suffering to the general members of our population, leading to their, painful lives and inevitable exiting?
So I don't think that ignorance is bliss for everyone around you. I think ignorance makes you a pain in the ass for everybody around you.
But I think it makes you a pain in the ass for yourself, because like ignorance to drug abuse, ignorance to what? What are you saying? Ignorance to is bliss. Just ignorance in general? Because if ignorance in general was bliss, then we would say that not acting rationally would be the best way to live your life, in which case, why don't you just put a fork in a plug socket?
Yeah, so I think ignorance in general is not bliss, but ignorance for specific people is often I mean, you can look at survey data and stuff that shows, like highly religious people who cling to Christianity or whatever, like might actually be happier than people who have this sort of materialist view of the world. But like, so I don't see they're clearly being a lot less rational. Well, I guess this goes back to how we're going to define rational, but they're clearly wrong about a lot more in the world than like the hardcore materialist. But on average, I think they're happier.
Like, okay, I understand where you're coming from, but like, first, I would like to say hello to my brother who's watching us from hospital right now. So, hello. Hey, Dean, love you. Hope you're doing well. Get well soon. And just back to the point, I mean, can you not see ignorance as leading to the suffering in the first place on a societal level, on an individual level? And it is ignorance of ourselves and the categorizations we make within experience that ultimately give us happiness in the first place, and that generating happiness out of caprice means that we don't even know whether the categorization what we've made for happiness was even the right one, and whether we're actually propagating our own suffering that we've characterized as happiness, because it's entirely subjective and we've misunderstood what it means. We could have totally misinterpreted what we are and who we are and how we should live our lives. One more thing as well. what I was going to say was you're also kind of making an argument to reject logic with logic, in which you're saying that, it would be rational and reasonable to reject logic itself, which gives you this ability to, which gives you the truth. And so, can you not see that, like, what you're actually doing is fundamentally impossible?
Not so. No, I'm not saying reject logic itself. I'm saying it may well be possible that rejecting the process of doing logic is not beneficial. Which I'm not even necessarily convinced of. I'm kind of agnostic on that point. But it's not that I'm going to use logic to say logic is inherently bad. It's just, hey, maybe it's possible for us to know too much for our own psychological benefit. Because I don't think
Of course, we could.
biologically we evolved to be most pleasured by the things that make the most sense. Whatever pumps dopamine through our body has very little to do with what's logically true or not.
Okay, but let's look at it like this: like, even your knowledge of human anatomy is a logical construction and a logical categorization of the world, in which you've appreciated the fact that human biology exists, and so, like, that's not given to you implicitly. Like, Descartes showed that. So, like, so, like, even this understanding of propagating dopamine and so on, and having this understanding of yourself, well, that's like the product of logic. Like,
but I don't have to understand that, though, for it to matter. Like, so
like,
whether or not we ever put a word to dopamine,
it
doesn't
matters.
matter.
It matters towards your actions that you take within the future, right? So, and you know that you want to maximize the probabilistic outcome of good and feeling happiness and feeling pleasure, but you're saying that there is a possibility that by trying to maximize that, you may actually minimize it, right? And so what you're saying,
It's possible, yeah.
yeah. So what you're trying to say is that, like, you may induce a state of, like, psychological angst about how you live your life, becoming a rational, like, orthorexic kind of guy that tries to, only eat so healthy, and then he ends up actually making his life really awful, like that kind of thing. Like, not even in a rational way. You could do something rational, but, like, miss out on the potluck opportunities that you could have had if you had been ignorant. Now, yeah, that's fair enough. But the whole point is that, like, what you're arguing for then is a gamble, and you're gambling with lower odds, and you cannot reject.
It's a gamble either way.
No, but the gamble is, like, look at it like this: if you reject reasoning, logic, the concepts which define, good, bad, right, and wrong, then you increase the if you accept them, you allow for a probabilistic behavior, which allows you to understand how you will, like, behave within the world. If you don't accept them, then everything becomes a gamble, right? So you don't know whether or not you will achieve any goal. You don't know what the goal is, and you can never know what the goal is. Knowledge becomes fundamentally distant from you. So the point is like, Aristotle says this best, I think, when he says, all men desire to know. And he says that because he says, like, we cannot help but otherwise. He says, like, why do you think you desire to see? Is it just because sight is pleasurable? He says, no, it's because it removes like a probability of, like, for example, of you being, ripped apart by a shark, but the only way that you would be able to understand that sight and what a shark is, and that you should be scared of it, blah blah blah, these categorizations in the world that give you, like, a probabilistic behavior of how to act. Well, that's through appreciation of rationally constructed concepts. And so, like, you can either, what you're arguing for is, like, a half appreciation of reason, and you're saying that if I appreciate reason so much that it gives me the world and all of those things around it, but I don't appreciate it to the point in which it actually dictates my behavior to a higher degree, then what you've already really said is that I'm using inductive reason to come to the conclusions about what my happiness will actually entail. And because of that, you're more likely to fail. Like, there is no rejection of it. Like if you reject the force and the rigor of logic, then you leave yourself open to suffering. That's why, like, there is no like, and not only that, you can't reject it totally, but, like, if you do that, then all you'll be doing is undermining that value in which you seek to achieve, and which you cannot help but achieve.
but sometimes knowing, but so
But you wouldn't be able to know what knowledge would bring you suffering until you knew it. Like, this is the point. Like, you're
yeah, but it's a gamble to trust that you have the right logic.
well, what
Like
you're
I mean,
saying is that there is a probability that that your reasoning is flawed. There is a probability that the concepts you have will lead to the wrong conclusions. But at least you have an opportunity to act in such a way that gives you the strongest epistemic justification to achieve that. Like, if you don't act in that way, then what you're opening the door to is epistemic, what's called epistemic epistemic subjectivism, and then, like, there is no need to appreciate something like science, like, and something like that. And that what you're saying is that it doesn't really give us any functional, like, pragmatic value. Well, clearly science has.
yeah.
Like, clearly, like, they're like, even like something like this, like, let's say you're a die-hard fundamentalist Christian, and you reject logic, you reject the reasoning that would give you, let's say, a freedom from an understanding that propagates suffering and masochism to yourself because you commit penance every day or something like that. And you're actually propagating your own suffering, but you see it as your own happiness because you think that you're freeing yourself from, an eternal torment. Well, in this worldview, that's absolutely acceptable, and that's one of the gambles that you take. Ignorance, like, may be bliss for some, like, on an occasion, but for most, ignorance is suffering incarnate.
Yeah, I guess we'd just need an empirical study to figure
I guess
that
I guess
out.
we need to use reason itself to judge whether reason is valuable.
But I can totally see that for lots of people having this sort of irrational view of death, where like everybody goes to this happy place and you're going to see all your family members and your dog and whatever, you're going to see all that again. I think for the average person, that actually helps them psychologically through life, even though it's completely bonkers in my view.
Well, fair enough, but like that can happen. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, sometimes ignorance does lead to some forms of, like, for example, the reduction of existential pain. But I mean, like, that's not saying that, like, this could not be resolved. Like, for example, like, you might gain a relationship with death that gives you an understanding of life that maximizes the authenticity of your everyday actions, whilst also mitigates the existential dread you face in the first place that moved you towards the religion. So then you could challenge the existential dread within yourself and why you're approaching the phenomena in such a way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I mean that's an approach I often take with people, and it's why I'm not, I have obviously, like, totally non-religious reasons for not being too upset about deaths and whatnot, and I think that is largely thanks to logic and reason and stuff. But at the end of the day, not everybody has my psychology, and like so I just think that there's plenty of people who don't process, like, hard reality well, and so I guess I'm not buying the idea that, like, sort of logic and reason like inherently moves you towards this sort of, like, better state of being.
First, there's no way to reject logic and reason inherently, because then you'll be rejecting what you are in the first place, who you are in the first place, and that's just essentially would cause ego death, and you'd lose your mind, like Vincent would be destroyed. But also, like, what you've got to appreciate is this, like, the individual would, like, that half appreciates logic may end up in the situation in which they understand death. They are given the concept of death because they cannot avoid it. They cannot help but associate themselves with other individuals, and that leads to them knowing that people will die. And so they flee from that death, entering the idle talk, which leads to a religious conception which brings them some relief. But by doing that, they're also they're like for example, there's another way to look at this. Let's imagine someone who rejected reason entirely and never knew the concept of death because they never left the totality of their existence, and they acted as if they would never die. Now this is kind of what happens. Like the rejection of the concept of death leads to a conception of immortality, and that time is no longer finite, which removes the values of our given actions day to day.
Yeah.
And in which case leads to the propagation of suffering in the day-to-day life through the pragmatics of how they behave. You may become like, like there's people who are religious that abstain from loads of pleasures. There's people who deliberately cause themselves pain, and ultimately create a life in which they through their rejection through fleeing death to bring themselves satisfaction from the existential dread, create actual real life pain through that ignorance.
Oh, I totally, I'm not advertising for a fundamentalist Christian worldview.
Are you sure?
God, that'd be hilarious if that was the takeaway from all this. That me of all people, like I was homeschooled up until high school, mostly on religious reasons. I was part of this, what I would very much call like a cult. And my whole story of coming out of religiosity and ending with, of course, a Christopher Hitchens debate. But no, it's funny. Anybody who knows me would be dying at the thought that like here I am advocating for fundamentalist Christian worldviews.
But can you not see that the overappreciation of hedonism is the same understanding of going through your life through a rejection of the rational?
No, yeah, I guess I'm not,
because that's what they're doing. I mean, look at it like this: they're still trying to they're trying to maximize the good experience for themselves. They're just doing it in a different way, and they're doing it in such a way in which they're not reasoning completely and only half reasoning, the same way that you would be doing as a hedonist. So all you do, it's the same process with different conclusions. And both inducing a conception of happiness, which may or may not actually come to exist, and there's no way to verify that unless you apply reason, which would force a rejection of the concept in the first place.
Yeah, so I guess it's the last premise that you're adding there, that hedonism is inherently some kind of rejection of logic.
Well, it would be a rejection of like a pleasure playing relationship and a greater conceptualization of that, which is the good life. That's what I would say.
Well, clarify that so
look at it like this, right? Like we understand that the maximization of pleasure for any given moment is, let's say, worth 1. Let's say we had 100 moments, so we would want them all. So the best life would equal 100, right? An intermix of pain and pleasure. I mean, this is like utility for a life. Intermix of pain and pleasure within a life, maybe 98, 99, 80, 70, whatever it is. Like, they are the possibilities that we can achieve. Now, what we are trying to do is maximize our achievement of 100, the greatest overall positive experience of all moments of our life, treated equally. And the reason that we treat them equally in the first place is because we recognize that we will live them, and that when we live them, we will appreciate them equally inherently, because that will be our present moment. Now, what you're saying is that we could maybe conceptualize of a world in which we didn't live as many lives, like as long of a life, and instead lived a more pleasant one for a shorter period of time. Now, we would first have to rationally verify whether this would actually give us a better experience and what ratio in our life would be the best. Like, perhaps, like, for example, I'm not saying that we'll all have to live lives like we do the same thing every day. That's not what I'm arguing for. What I'm arguing for is use it as a process which gives us how we should live our day to day. And how we should live our day to day would be in regards to more than that moment in which we are living. How many moments? Okay. Well, the only way that we can gauge how many moments is to understand that each moment will be equally as valuable as we live it, and therefore there is an essential equality within our experience. So that's where So I agree that's the baseline, but then I'm just layering on things like
the odds that I live 5 years versus another 20, like the things that I can do now versus then, um, how much, I'm just, there are other factors that I think weight,
Oh yeah, yeah. Like
sort of,
I'm not saying like, but like it depends on what we're talking about. But then you would be relying upon a conception of the good life that was still um beyond how you understand living it, right? Like you can't induce that. That wouldn't be subjective anymore. It would be objective. So like for example, we might say like, you know what? Enjoy yourself while you're young. Travel a lot because you're not going to be able to do it when you're older. Do these different things, and this is the
yeah.
wisdom of what ancestors that's permeating through of how to live the good life. But what we never say is take drugs. What we never say is do certain
Don't we?
behaviors. Like, well, sometimes we do, but like we can't rely on our
Depends
ancestors
which
totally. You know what I
drugs.
mean? Like, yeah, I guess, I
Yeah.
guess. And we can't rely on our ancestors totally. Some of them are just stoners. You know what I mean? Like, I watched a video of like an old man taking a hit off a bong a while ago, and it was just like he takes like a hit for like a solid minute. So I don't know if we can
Yeah.
trust him. But
Yeah.
like for example, there's another argument. Like you're saying, like you mightn't enjoy yourself when you're older, but like a lot of people become even more hedonistic when they're older. They're like, well, I haven't got long left now.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
so it's one of those things where it's like what we should rely upon is that which can be rationally concluded, and if we don't, then we are acting in caprice. And I'm not saying that that necessarily dictates that you live like a life of absolute um you know restriction. Like I just drink less regularly than I would if I didn't care about myself when I'm old. Like
Yeah.
like appreciating health wise, a vegan lifestyle, you can achieve all of those like good experiences that you this is coming from someone who loved meat, dairy, and eggs, like especially meat and dairy. Like I was about meat and cheese. That was my life. Like
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
like junk food in general. Like I like Doritos, Pringles, like bloody like chocolate, crisps, McDonald's, things like that. But like these things are like these exist in a vegan form, and like not only that, when you experience a vegan diet, it opens you up to like new and different experiences of pleasure, which then ultimately broadens your horizon and helps you understand yourself anyway. So
Yeah.
like what I'm saying is that through eating like a plant-based diet, you could achieve like all the happiness you have. Like I think there's a good chance you can anyway. Um, Achieve all the happiness like elation you do on a non-plant-based diet, with um the benefit of having a more moral lifestyle and having a reduced likelihood of things like all-cause mortality, which may cut your life short, increase the suffering of things like dementia, like emotional suffering, physical suffering when you're older, and things like that. And okay, like yeah, you should still exercise. I'm not going to tell you not to like that's not something you should do. Like you should exercise. You should maybe like make sure you don't eat too much junk food, whether it's vegan or not. Like of course you can still hurt yourself with vegan junk food. Eat so much coconut oil, you give yourself heart disease. It still happens. Like it's not a perfect diet. It's about whole food, plant based is the best. But by eating plant-based foods, you are eating a moral diet. You're eating a moral diet which prevents suffering and helps resolve the conflicts within your consciousness and your rationality. But you're also you're not necessarily giving up anything in the first place. So like you're saying, like being a hedonist, you would have to be a non-vegan. Well, no, not really.
No,
Like
no,
there's a
yeah,
lot of
no,
vegan
that,
hedonists.
yeah, yeah, no,
Junk food vegans
absolutely,
all
no.
over the place.
I'm definitely not saying that hedonism somehow rules out veganism. That's just purely going to be down to someone's personal psychology, um, and
Well,
I don't doubt that plenty of people can have like maybe even equal gustatory pleasure from a vegan diet. I'm not denying that. No.
yeah. So why like this is the thing. Like, so would it not be worthwhile to try it?
Well, maybe if I didn't, maybe, maybe if I didn't, I mean, I suppose I could force myself to try to eat a bunch of stuff that I currently know that I don't like. Like,
Well,
that's
one,
the thing
that's
is that like,
somewhat valuable because like they say you got to try a food 14 times before before you have enough information to like actually make a decision. Like it's
gosh,
like I mean like
I mean, like fruit. Like I have not eaten a fruit in, I don't know, maybe like 5 6 years. um,
Well, I mean, like Doritos are vegan, man. Like you can get chili
well,
heat wave Doritos and stuff.
yeah.
Like,
I
like,
Funny enough,
like
I don't like Doritos.
what kind of foods do you like? Because I guarantee
uh,
there'll be a vegan alternative.
oh dear. So when I list off a bunch of meats, um, um, what do I like?
Because there's
Um,
vegan burgers now. There's vegan steaks. There's like
yeah,
there's
yeah,
like
yeah.
there's vegan
So
cheeses. There's like
the vegan cheeses and stuff I'd be interested in. I've heard good that I'm going to try the Impossible Burger. Though I haven't heard many great reviews from what is it, like Beyond Meat or something.
it depends. Like honestly, it totally depends on what you get. Like I think like for example, a really like do you like chicken burgers?
Yeah, yeah, they're fine.
Like a really good like alternative to them is like Quorn's hot and spicy burger. Like that is unreal. Like I really love that. Like, but I mean, it's personal taste. Like, don't get us wrong.
Yeah,
But like, you don't know that you don't like something until you try it anyway.
yeah,
So you're gonna
yeah.
have
No,
to try. So like, you're gonna have to try them.
yeah, yeah. No, that's fair. And I mean, I'm actually pretty adventurous with food. I'll try pretty much anything. So I guess like it's going to come back to the fact that I just don't see how, whether I order that Big Mac from McDonald's, I don't see that having an impact on animal welfare. I mean, obviously,
Why?
you know, we spent several hours
Yeah,
going
like
back
three
and forth
hours
about
now.
this.
Like more.
Yeah,
Like why?
yeah,
Why? Like we'll make our closing statements, then we'll do a
yeah,
quick
yeah.
Q&A, and then I'll let you go. Like you know.
Okay.
So I'll go first with my closing statement, so that gives you the opportunity to
Yep.
have the last word, and then we'll answer some questions, guys. Thank you for sticking around for so long. It's been quite a long
Yeah.
one, but I think it's
Yeah,
been
what
quite
kind of
interesting.
lunatics have listened this long to? Anyway, but yeah, go ahead.
Right, yeah. So my concluding statement would be that to be a rational person is to increase the likelihood and the probability that you will live the good life. The good life is the maximal probability that you will achieve happiness and overall joy throughout your whole life. And when we give in to irrationality, all we do is increase the likelihood that we will be the propagation of our own suffering. And so And so what we should do is appreciate reason for what it is, the liberty from ourselves. And I say that in the words of Hegel, man by nature is not what he should be. We should appreciate that knowledge gives us power, and power over how we will act and behave within the world to achieve that which we inherently desire, that which is most desirable. It lets us know what it is, it lets us conceptualize and move towards it, and one day when we have better conceptions because we have moved through these desires, we will achieve those desires more accurately. And just to bring it back to the first part of the debate, the subjectivity of the individual acting within an industry, we have an overall economic impact. And what we do is we may have small impacts, but those small impacts turn into larger ones. When we begin to reinforce the actions from other individuals, we know we are not acting alone because we are using the dictates of reason, and as other individuals continue to act rationally, they will continue to become more vegan within their actions. And so what we do is we propagate the likelihood of abolishing animal exploitation within the world, within industries, and ultimately undermining the economic format of non-vegan companies whilst promoting the competitive market alternatives of vegan businesses, which ultimately seek to destroy their competition within the capitalist state. And what we do is increase the likelihood of veganism being proposed and ideologically supported by the mechanisms of power within our state. We also propagate the power we have with other individuals and influence them ideology when they observe our behaviors and listen to our words and performances in reality. So thank you very much, and that was my statement.
Very nicely put. Yeah, I guess all I would say to sum up is the only thing that individuals can be responsible for are the things that they can actually affect, and a better world has more pleasure in it, a worse world has less, and you're responsible to the degree that you can you can leverage those better or worse states of the world. And I'm not convinced that that an individual has the has the ability to impact demand to the degree that would actually change animal welfare. I think if it were just a matter of making a small difference versus a big difference, I think small differences count. I just don't think that an individual can meet the threshold to make any difference on the side of on the demand side in the meat market. But that being said, I hope this doesn't actually convince anybody, and I hope that everybody who listens actually stays vegan, because in numbers, there are strength in numbers, and yeah. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, that was great. Thank you very much, by the way, Vincent, for coming on and having this absolutely, very long debate. And like, you've held your position well, and I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these like varying points of view. So yeah, thank you, and I hope and thank you to the audience for listening to it. If you wish to ask me or Vincent a question, probably going to spend another 10 minutes. I don't know how long you've got. Like I'm keeping you here.
It's all good.
Maybe spend another 10 minutes just answering some quick questions, and then we'll call it there, because it's nearly a 4-hour long debate. And I think that's a very long time for people to sit and watch. So if you have any questions, fire away. So how did you find that, man? And was it enjoyable for you, or was it like absolute hell?
No, I like doing I like just talking about philosophy stuff. So it was fun for sure.
Yeah, but I think that's nice. I love having philosophical conversations. And the book that I was talking about before, by the way, which I said I was going to try and find, it's called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's about the individuals. This is like kind of like my point of the experience machine. It's like people who kind of go and they're in the city and they come down and they see that the city of absolute happiness is actually run upon the perpetual suffering of like a baby. And they were like, do you stay and live this life of happiness, or do you walk away on principle that this is wrong? And it's like, I would walk away. I'd say that like I wouldn't want to be the cause of the suffering of the baby, and I could see my presence there as reinforcing the social structure which gives validation to this level of behavior, this kind of behaviors. And I think obviously you would maybe stay.
Yeah. Well, just because I think what snuck in there was you said like be the cause. I just wouldn't see myself as the cause there.
That's fair enough. Like obviously I don't think you're a horrible person trying to torture children. So
no.
I can see where you're coming from. So I don't think there is any questions, probably because we've went through pretty much all of Western philosophy in this debate.
Yeah. That's all right.
So yeah, I mean, unless anyone's got a quick question now, I'm just going to call the debate, and we can, just exchange pleasantries and part ways. But it was great having you on anyway. Like, if you ever want to, would you ever want to, obviously if you ever wanted to have a debate again in the future, if you ever need any advice on veganism or trying anything like that, if you ever want anything like that, like obviously just reach out. Chris Grant said, would life be special if we knew everything? What do you think?
To the extent that we can feel pleasure and pain, that's all I see the importance of life being. So whether we know anything or not, I'm not sure why that would, like, we could know nothing, we could know everything, but the only point to exist would be to feel pleasure. So
no, I could see that, like, obviously impacting that. Like, look at it like this, like, if you knew everything, then would life not be inherently boring, and you'd be in a state of mental anguish where everything it would be the same moment occurring again and again and again for all eternity? Or would it be an appreciation of the moment to such a high degree that every moment is bliss? I can't say. Would it be, like it's not something that we can really question what the life of God would be like. But I think that it's certainly better to have knowledge about how we will behave. Like human existence is probably never going to be, this absolute guarantee. But let's say we did know what would occur. It would only give us the knowledge of what would occur. It wouldn't give it the experience of that. And I think that's why more knowledge is better. So yeah. But yeah, I think that's it. So thank you very much, Vincent, for joining us. And thank you very much to the audience. I hope everyone has a nice day and tries to gain some perspective. Bye, guys.